Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Today, we are joined again by Mtume Gant, and we're going to finish up our discussion of Cedric Robinson's Forgeries of Memory and Meaning. Disclaimer in advance, this was like 110, something like that, page chapter. And so we're not going to be able to fully really deconstruct everything that's going on in this chapter. We're going to try our best, but our best will not be a replacement from actually reading the chapter and getting all that you can out of it. There's just a lot. But very much looking forward to this conversation, looking forward to finalizing this discussion. This has been a fun series. We do have a playlist that this stream is connected to with the other 4 parts of the discussion that we've done. And each of them has been really interesting. Highly recommend the book. I think I would, I probably would. A lot of people like to say Black Marxism is Cedric Robinson's kind of like magnum opus or most important work, and I think that I would probably argue for this one. I mean, there's that would be an interesting debate to have, but I think that this is like a really, really good book, and it's a very sophisticated look at, racial representations within film with a focus on Black representation, but not solely, because he does talk about the way other racialized groups are represented within theater and film as well. So yeah, anyway, this has been great. The period we're going to talk about today is the so-called Golden Age of Hollywood, which I'll let Mtume say a little bit more about what that means, because I'm not a film person enough to really know. But basically, it's the sound era. Is basically what we're talking about, is like the period in which films transformed or transitioned from silent film into sound films, and so it's kind of early sound film, really up until World War II that we're talking about here. Let's see. I guess the other thing I would say too is something that we haven't plugged enough on these discussions is Mtume Gant is the host of a podcast as well, Within Our Gates podcast, which obviously we talked about Within Our Gates in one of the previous episodes, the movie Within Our Gates by Oscar Micheaux. But I really encourage folks to check that out. There's a link to that in the show description. And of course, he's also a filmmaker, actor, musician, and assistant professor of film at SUNY Purchase, and the director of short films Spit, Whiteface, and Mold of Malachi, as well as a forthcoming feature film, The Hand That Feeds, and has got more stuff on the way in that realm as well. So, Mtume, good to be with you again, my friend. This is looking forward to this discussion.
Hey, what up, everybody? Good to be here. Always. This is the best way to spend my spring break. Honestly, not I'm not lying at all.
Are you on spring break right now?
Yeah, I'm on spring break. I'm
nice.
Forgive the weird lighting in here. We just moved though, so I'm held up in a corner while like they're actually painting in the other room. So
Nothing like a New York move. I have.
Yeah.
Someday we could exchange horror stories on.
Yeah, but you know what though? Props to old school New York apartments. Like they're doing stuff in the other room and I can't even hear them. Like that old pre-war, concrete and whatever was in there. It's like, yes, new apartments, you could hear everything.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, all the asbestos and the lead lined walls and things like that.
There is that too, though. That is the other, and if anyone grew up in New York, they remember when we were out for asbestos for like a month. I'll never forget that one. People who grew up of a certain age in New York remember that, where the schools didn't start for I was like a month late because they had to clean them all.
Yeah, Philly has that happen occasionally.
Oh wow! Yeah, it was one big time for us, but I don't think it's happened since. That's interesting.
I mean, I think Philly needs the big one where they just do a big overhaul at all the schools.
Yeah.
They tend to have like the catastrophe where the one school ends up having to be closed down completely because it gets so bad, and then All right, so let's see. Let's get into it.
Yeah.
Anything you want to say up front about this whole chapter?
I mean, I think the thing that I've kind of come to with the book for me is Robinson is doing, I think, a really necessary reexamination of how we think about film and its development, because he and we'll talk about it. He talks about these kind of hagiographies of movie making, and this kind of golden age was like this place of like purity, even where there was like racial or like gender discrimination, like mishaps. It's done. It's almost painted like innocence, right? Like an innocence of like they just didn't know better, rather than Robinson really frames it within the imperial project, and he has a real grounding in understanding history, colonialism, imperialism, how it exists, and then the image making that kind of coincides it, because this is all nation building projects, and film is technology. Like the art almost comes out of the after. It's primarily like a technological advancement, and technology has been used for really imperialism and extraction from people, and to kind of create these things. So I think he's doing a really important piece in that. I mean, I have much other thoughts. That's like the big, so like this chapter, he really kind of digs into kind of this last kind of half of what, I mean, the golden age is weird because there's different people who posit it at different times. There's people who take it all the way to the 60s, sometimes, like pretty much into the collapse. I think that's a little like reductive. I do like I think it's correct to start it in the sound era, which is something we should talk about. Sound and sound sync, and that's and its importance. So you do that, and then, but I do think probably where kind of Robinson ends the book, actually. I think it's good to take it to World War II, right? And then you probably have like a second half of the golden age, because like World War II films are very specific, which I'd be curious to know if he ever wrote about World War II films, because that's deep. And like there's that documentary Five Came Back, which I think has its flaws. Jared Ball's done some good stuff on that doc series, but they talk about how people like William Wyler and John Huston and were involved in making pro-America films and stuff like that. And so this is like the shift before that, and I think that's a huge shift. So he kind of taking us all the way to really to that point, which I think is interesting, because I do think that is a good place to stop a certain kind of thinking about film, because there's also different things that are happening in art and expression that change film once you hit the 50s. Also, that the late 40s, really the 50s, which I think I'll also mention at some point too.
Yeah, that's all interesting, and I think I mean, the way he leaves this section basically is just sort of like, okay, after World War II, a new racial regime is sort of necessary. So a lot of this other stuff like doesn't, not that it doesn't matter anymore, but it's like always with the racial regime thing, it's like, you take new things and then you kind of update them and then shift some of the representations around a little bit. And, I think probably he could have, his kind of nod and wink to us is like, I could have kept going and just doing this because it just goes on and on. But like,
Right.
I've kind of already laid out how the process works, so somebody else can do that. But he may have written other things about it, because he did write about film in other places. And that's one of the things, you and I talked about yesterday, is just like, it'd be interesting to try to track down some of his different writings around film from periods after this, because he does kind of also, he'll make nods along the way to stuff he thinks about 90s and stuff like that, but it's like be like a footnote, or in some cases like a sentence that's just like,
it's a
what?
strange aside. Yeah, we'll talk about the Death Row Records one. That was like, what?
Yeah.
Okay, homie.
Yeah, if anyone can help us find that article on Death Row Records, that would be appreciated. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So, all right. So this starts out, there's a section called The Sounds of Racism that it starts out. He starts out with a guide quote from Mantan Moreland in The King of Zombies, which is a 1941 film. So he's starting out really at the end of the era that he's talking about. And the quote is, "If there's one thing I wouldn't want to be twice, zombies is both of them." And the film is called The King of Zombies. He offers this short little, reflection on this. He says, 14 years into the sound era, Mantan Moreland's shrouded declaration constituted an astoundingly bold critique of the caricatures which passed as black representation in the movies produced and released by major studios. We shall return to Moreland in due time, teasing out the subtlety of his resistance. Suffice it to say, for the present, that Moreland was publicly rejecting Movieland's insulting black tropes of the happy slave and the dumb darky. The zombie, brain-dead black labor was as perfect a slave as could be conjured up by a racialized imaginary. So that's the introduction.
Yeah, and one other thing he says about Moreland I think is interesting, because then he'll come back to him really at the end of the chapter. So he's kind of using, I think, Moreland as like a circle to kind of encapsulate his critique, I think, of racial regimes and how black people work within them. But he says, no fool, he had resorted to an elaborate and imaginative subterfuge, the language of the Negro jester, cleverly costuming his resistance to these dehumanizing black icons in a comedic trope. So it's funny because when I read that line, I wasn't exactly sure where Robinson was going to go with the idea of resistance. I mean, by the end of it, I was pretty clear, and I think you're pretty clear with it. Though I do have questions about after resistance, but we could talk about that later. But I think that's really important because there is this idea that Moreland, that I've heard people say before too, was doing some kind of really strong level resistance. I think it's the classic conversation about, can you code within something that is, an imperial project, and does it really work? I remember Matthew Diawara had his piece where he talks about Eddie Murphy a little bit about that. He kind of gets into this about, you could see what Eddie was doing in 48 Hours as some kind of defiance of white power. But in the end, in the film, white power does have control over him. So basically his resistance is futile, essentially, or juvenile. So, which is interesting because then Robinson also talks about how you have vestiges of the old that go into the future. So there is a way that you could think of Mantan Moreland's existence and Eddie's existence as a continuum.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd have to watch this film again, but Spike Lee's Bamboozled is sort of like, it's a conscious, it's not Moreland, but it's the name of the main character is Mantan in it, and it's a conscious reference point of the film, and it is about also this kind of like doing incredibly, like, performing these very racist stereotypes for a white audience, but then being subversive within that, and like, what does that,
what does that
actually do or mean?
Yeah. And in many ways, I haven't watched in a couple of years. And in many ways, Bamboozled is successful in it. It has major flaws, but it is successful in, I think, in making that essential point. I think, and then using Mantan is very, very, very pointed in many ways. But yeah, I'd be curious if Robinson ever wrote about that film, actually.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
I'd be very interested in his takes on that. I feel like he would have some really solid criticisms, though, of it. I have a feeling. So then one of the next things he begins to talk about, and we'll bring in, is that it says in the late 1920s, sound had opened up the studio's gates to black talent. So this is an interesting thing because sound in movies, I mean, we take it for granted. And when we're talking about sound, we're talking about sync sound. Because movies, they had scores and all that type of stuff. But in the 20s, you began to get what we call sync sound in movies, where you could, basically do what we're doing now. It's hard to get people to imagine that there was a world of movies that didn't have that, right? So he writes like musicals, the new genre had made it obvious that few white actors could convincingly impersonate blacks, and that black artistry and black music were money makers, which is just funny. They're like, oh, wait a minute. These white folks
Yeah.
can't dance. They can't sing. We can't do that, though. Oh man, have you ever seen Julie Dash's Illusions?
I haven't.
Oh, you should check that out. It's a really cool short that she did. I won't say cool, it's great. And it's about a black woman who works in a Hollywood office, and they basically do that. They have a white woman, a black woman dubbing a white woman singing. So it's like this woman, like white women singing in the black, it's really a black voice. It's a really good short. It's like 40 minutes long. People should definitely, I think it's one of her best films. But I think this is interesting because you're getting into this idea of the musicals, and it kind of goes to that thing. That's like the first thing they want for black people. Well, let's have them do music and dance and get up there and do all the performances that we like to see. I find that interesting that that's the thing that kind of catapults black people into Hollywood favor.
Yeah, no, I think that, and it makes sense, I mean, like, from a kind of racist point of view, but like, it makes sense in understanding that like white people are really not going to do like a convincing job of, trying to mimic black art, basically,
right.
Yeah.
I mean, and one other thing I'll also say, I mean, this is where like some of the other kind of understandings of film become also important. I mean, film was not yet a psychological genre yet. I mean, drama wasn't really psychological yet either. I mean, you don't really get that into like the 30s, which is why The Emperor Jones then becomes interesting later, and we'll table that. But the 30s with like the group theater, Stanislavski in Russia, I don't remember exactly when he came to the U.S. I think he came in the 20s. I could be kind of wrong. It would make sense he would have came in the 20s because in the group theater with Lee Strasberg, Harold Clurman, and them, the kind of forefathers of what we call method acting and naturalism happened. So theater hadn't really gone naturalistic. So I say all this to say everything is like these grand spectacles. People went to the theater, people went to watch movies to see grand spectacle. So there's also that part that's what audiences were used to. This watching Marlon Brando in a corner or James Dean emote is not something that really comes for like 30 years. That's not a thing. It's really a post World War II phenomena. You have some of it beginning with like Cagney and like Public Enemy and things like that. Those things start to happen. But for the most part, this is the predominant thing. Big flourishing musicals, and even white people had them too. I mean, if you watch some of the old like things, like what's that movie where like they're like they shoot the big like they're like in a big like river and shit, and like they're like dancing women. It's like one of those old Hollywood movies where it's just like it's a wild spectacle of like like hundreds of dancers, like big water slides. I mean, yeah, dude, like this is the stuff that people went and watch. It's wild. Like you're like, this is the stuff that they were into. So you're just like, whoa, someone might know in the chat what I'm talking about, but yeah, it's this is the stuff that people like to watch. So he keeps going. Yeah. You go
I was just thinking, I was just thinking of Casablanca, and that's 43. Like I was trying to think of like, when did this come out? Because that's kind of like one of those films.
So Bogart is considered one of the beginning. He's like proto that, right? He's like proto that because he and then you start getting a kind of more character driven line. So Bogart, Cagney, Joan Crawford, things like that. That could be it. Let me see. You have about the director. Yes. I think he's one of like Gold Diggers of 1934. Yeah. That director. He used to do like these like wild things, man. The people like if you just go to YouTube and watch it, you're like, really? Like it's just wild stuff,
Well, yeah, I mean, and we're going to talk about some wild stuff as we go through this for sure. Because Trader Horn, I think, is like definitely one of these films that's just like way out there.
Yes. So we should get to maybe like the plantation genre. I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit. Yeah.
So I mean, there's a few different genres that he takes up in this whole chapter. So I'll just kind of review some. So he has the plantation genre. He has like an urban black kind of set of image. Like, so Hallelujah is a film that we'll talk about a little bit that like he kind of differentiates from this other film, Hearts and Dixie. Those Hearts and Dixie and Hallelujah are the ones he talks about in this first section that we'll discuss a little bit. Later on, he does talk a little bit about he talks about we'll talk about jungle films and the purposes of those, which is very interesting discussion.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot of actually the chapter where he talks about that. There's also horror films come out of this discussion a little bit, as do black gangster movies, which is an interesting part, the all black Western, which is an interesting genre. And there's a few other things I think towards the end that he brings in, but Plantation is one of the big things he kind of starts out talking about along, these two early musicals in the dawn of the sound era, Hallelujah and Hearts and Dixie. So
Yeah. And I mean, it kind of like look a sum up of it. The plantation genre he talks about is like this like romanticization of the antebellum South, and it looked to kind of rehab slavery. I mean, we recognize that with Gone with the Wind, right? I think that's something that we recognize it, but Gone with the Wind is not the first. It's like there was a series of films. Gone with the Wind probably is like the magnum opus of the plantation genre, right? And he talks about what I found very interesting. I don't have the direct quote. I have like a summary here, but it was saying that he saw the Old South as like an escapist vehicle for Americans, which I found really interesting. I wish I could find the direct quote because he says it better than I just said it.
I think I'll find it.
Yeah.
I have it. Hang on. All right. So it's the film industry. This is a quote from, is it Cripps probably?
I think it's Cripps,
or Guerrero maybe.
I
but he's
think
talking about
he
works through multiple critics in this section, but he says the film industry began to conceptualize and produce the Old South as an escapist vehicle, a panacea for depression area anxieties.
That's the big part. Yeah. So like we're entering the Depression, and there's this, and it's funny because I thought about this. Ironically, I thought about the Golden Girls. I thought about Blanche and how she has this kind of, reverie for the Old South and that kind of thing. And I remember one of the episodes, there was this talk. Someone did mention to her that like what she remembered was total BS, right? And there was a way that she even knew that also. And like it was about, we had to feel better, they had to make us feel better. So it's so interesting that the Old South became this place that you could kind of escape from the anxieties of the depression that was there in America. I found that very interesting. But then I guess it isn't interesting because, if it's white people are dominant and black people are subordinate, that'll make white people feel a whole lot better.
I love this quote too, which, so it's interesting. He's always so critical of the people he's bringing in, which is great. But he says, nevertheless, neither black nor white viewers took notice of the missing ingredient in this dramatic conflict, the oppressive system that had put blacks on the bottom rail. But that would have been asking too much. He's just saying Cripps was mistaken about saying it would be asking too much because he was like, 80% of American blacks still lived in the South in 1929. So he's saying like for most black people, it's not at all asking too much. And Within Our Gates does this. But yeah, I mean, he really situates it as, and we can go into this a little more if you want, but like this removal of peonage, and I mean, interestingly, he sort of talks about how obviously it was more violent to black folks, but also how rough it was for like white workers under the system. Even if I think that he says they constituted 10% or something like that. But he basically sees that as the purpose kind of, and notes that, peonage was in the public domain. He goes through all the places that it's talked about, from the New York Times to Washington Post to Florida Times Union. And actually, I mean, kind of interestingly, because I guess at this time it was technically illegal. And so he talks about like US attorneys and stuff like that trying to prosecute it against white planters. So, anyways, it's just an interesting thing. But I think it's true when you think about this genre, which he kind of ends with too. I mean, there's he references Song of the South by Disney, distributed by RKO, which we'll get into RKO a little bit later too. But this is where you get the Brer Rabbit, Brer Fox, like all this stuff. It's where you get the Splash Mountain Disneyland ride, which has now been transformed into a what's that film, Princess and the Frog themed ride at Disney World, but it's the same exact ride. And it's interesting because as a kid I remember those cartoons too, but I don't actually remember the film that much. I think what Disney had done by the time we were kids was like kind of take those cartoons and make them shorts sometimes. And I think they were like a little bit more conscious too about which ones they played, because they're also like, they're just super like, it's one of those things where it's like it's so racist, but it's all being done by animals. So you're like, what's going, it's, I mean, there's ways I think where I didn't necessarily totally pick up on it as a kid, because I was just like, I don't, it didn't. But again, like that film Song of the South is like that. It's totally the plantation genre. Like, there's no conflict between the black servant class folks and the white ruling class folks. And actually the black servant class is raising their children without the father, who's gone away. And I don't even know if it's ever explained why he's gone away. And the so then Uncle Remus is telling these stories to this white kid of like, this is, and of course they're also stolen stories, because it's like through a version that was rewritten by a white author. So anyway, let's get back to Hearts and Dixie though. Did you have other things on this?
Well, there's this line that he says on 274, which I think is great. It kind of because you explained about the peonage and how pervasive it was, right? And Robinson gives like a lot of these great figures. It's that final line. I'll read that. Right, he writes, in short, peonage was in the public domain. It is not entirely beyond the realm of possibility, then, that in neglecting the subject of peonage in Hearts and Dixie, the studio and some film audiences were acting out of vested interests rather than ignorance. Right. So, because like he was trying, like there was like maybe like arguments by some, I think it was by Cripps, that maybe like they didn't know, they were just kind of ignorant of it, rather than like purposely suppressing this reality. And Robinson gives all these kind of material realities that, like, I'm sorry, there's no way you could have ignored this. And if it's not in Hearts and Dixie, which is that and Hallelujah are these very seminal films, it means that they were doing it on purpose, right? And which I think speaks to film as a propaganda medium, right? I mean, he talks about that earlier with Birth of a Nation, and
right,
like I mentioned with
and
Clyde
he makes
Taylor.
that he makes that comparison to Birth of a Nation a few times in this chapter to say if we see how much violence and how much racial, I mean, obviously he's already had his critique of Birth of a Nation, but he's like, it can't be both of these things. It can't be a world in which there are like black troops like trying to figure out how to like genocide all of the white Southerners, and be also a world in which you have and like the rape stuff and all that stuff within Birth of a Nation, and be a world in which there's like total like pacification and calm, and like black people actually I would say, presented as enjoying their experience, still living with the white masters, basically.
Yeah. Oh man, I should have found it. I was telling Jared yesterday about if anyone's read Leroy Jones and Mary Baraka's Dutchman, uh, they know this line. There's a great line where he's arguing with Lula and he says about, oh yeah, plantations were like these great places where just black people were just skipping along. And he says it in this kind of irony when Lula's trying to reference him about like the black past. And he's like, come on, man. Like this idea that we were just, happy and, plantations were these wonderful places is something out of your white imagination. It has nothing to do with the reality and also the emotional kind of presence of black people ever, even when that was happening. It's total bullshit.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I started to put Zippity Doodah on one of the like Instagram shares, and I was like, oh my God, I can't do this. And
yeah.
There's a Louis Armstrong version, and I listened to it and I was like, oh my God, like this is just terrible.
I mean, I didn't know that song was something to kind of was a problematic song until I was maybe a teenager.
Yeah.
I'm 45, and like that song was readily in the 80s, readily heard in the 80s,
Yeah.
all the time.
No, I know. I had teachers that sang it.
Oh, man. I'm sure I did too. I'm just blocking it out. I'm sure I did too. But I remember commercials but you're right about the kind of Disney short thing, like the plucking out. And they would put these things in there. Because I don't think I've ever seen Song of the South in its entirety, but I've definitely seen most of it, plucked out. And I remember it. I remember when I first looked at it again on YouTube as an adult. I was like, oh, I remember this. Yeah, so he goes into Hearts in Dixie, which is, I tried to, did you find Hearts in Dixie?
No.
I tried to find it. Yeah, so this is I asked this because I find this interesting, and you'll see films you can find that he mentions in films that you can't. So I tried to find Hearts in Dixie, and I couldn't. I mean, I didn't do like a serious dive, but it's not like easily available. Like Hallelujah, I was able to find very easily. But Hearts in Dixie was not an easy film to find, and Hearts in Dixie was like the first full length Black musical produced by a major studio in 1929. And it becomes this thing where they're really into these audible pictures, right? These big musicals, and it debuted in August. So he has this line here. Clearly, the film shared commonalities, but the significant differences between them concerning their creative aspirations, production origins, and their subsequent realizations serve to establish alternative strategies as studio models for Black representation during the sound era. So there was this interest in finding these new ways to kind of make films for these particular audiences. And there's another line that I find really interesting when it talks about Hallelujah. On the other hand, Hallelujah introduced specific ornaments and conventions of representation of Black urbanity, which would reappear in musical features in the 40s, Cabin in the Sky, Stormy Weather, and the 1950s Carmen Jones and the musical shorts of those decades. So Cabin in the Sky and Stormy Weather are still very highly regarded pieces.
Yeah, so they're like canonical Black films.
Canonical Black films. And I find it very, very pointed that Robinson needs to connect them to Hallelujah, which he has a lot of criticism of. I haven't watched Stormy Weather recently, and I probably have only seen Cabin in the Sky when I was a kid, but I actually do want to revisit. But I do find that very, very pointed that he wants to connect that. But I like this idea of ornaments, though, and these ornaments that stay. I think that's a really important thing to think about in movies and in cinema, because they become these kind of long sustained traditions, and that's largely what films have done. They create these ornaments that we always try to kind of recreate. If we can acknowledge maybe they're a little racist or sexist or something like that, or xenophobic, we try to buffer them, give them a little bit of a makeover and reclaim them, as people would say. and now you have a new shiny version, but it's still the same turd,
Yeah.
under.
So yeah, one thing just on Hearts and Dixie too that he does bring up, which is important, is the character Step and Fetch It, Lincoln Perry. He becomes an important recurring figure, as he says, as a faux black culture, and similar. I mean, not Mantan Moreland is more subversive, but it's like these are kind of the figures in which you get this kind of transition, I guess, from like some of the black minstrelsy stuff that we talked about in previous chapters to early film, and including into sound film and including into radio programming. He talks about Amos and Andy later on, which is something my parents remember listening to growing up. And then Step and Fetch It is one of these characters too. And you can find like very easily stuff on YouTube, just like short scenes basically that are taken out of movies with Step and Fetch It. The one part I wanted to point to at the end of this little section here is just at the end of this page is really this at a historical juncture in America marked by substantial black migration to the north, to urban areas. The plots of the two films were insinuated into racial conceits necessitated by King Cotton and Southern agriculture, subscribing to the public belief that cotton production was owed to black laborers. The films adhered to the protocol of the emergent plantation genre in the movie industry by erasing poor white workers. The film industry, having already deemed poor whites superfluous in national memory, proved instrumental in concealing the present capitalist agenda for them. And I just thought that, again, like he does this throughout the book, but also a lot in this chapter. That's really the only time I think that he talks about white workers too much in this chapter. But he goes back to capital and imperialism a lot. And so, I just thought that was an interesting point too. And he brings in, discussions of the Atlanta Chamber of Commerce. This is actually a funny quote. So Jack Kirby relates this in the 1920s. In notable advertisements, Southern companies, trade associations, and governments vied with one another in portraying white laborers, children of the populous masses, as degraded and docile. The Atlanta Chamber of Commerce, for example, promised prospective industrialists that in the South, the worker is your friend, efficient, willing, Anglo-Saxon. Anyway.
I mean, it is propaganda of that era is so stiff. I just find it and I always wonder, like, how do people react to this stuff? I'm actually very curious. Like, were they like, oh man, shut the fuck up, or did people actually like get into this? I find it very interesting because to me it just sounds so.
Yeah, well, it's sort of like what when I was a kid, people still occasionally referred to WASPs, which is white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, for anybody who doesn't know.
Yeah.
But like it's fascinating because there's all this outcry that the right has had about political correctness and all of these sort of things, but it's like there's and the attendant modern versions of it, DEI and whatever else, but it was like this was not, I mean, it sometimes was used in a kind of like there was a negative connotation to it sometimes when you'd hear it used some places. Like, these people think that they're elite and they run everything, right? But it was also they think they're elite and they run everything, and so anyway, and it was just interesting. And then obviously here it's connecting it to what we would think of as like a Protestant work ethic, right? Which again is something that's a propaganda function of convincing white people that to be a good Christian is to like work without rebelling, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it'll probably come up if we ever touch back with Disney, but like there's like in Ariel Dorfman's How to Read Donald Duck, he talks about that heavily, about the city versus the periphery. We'll talk about that when we get to Jungle Films, because it's kind of a similar thing where in the city that's where that ethic is, and the periphery, they don't have that ethic because they're so backwards, so he doing it with animals and not with race, but the racial ornaments and the signifiers that you realize that Donald Duck is essentially a white person, and everyone else on the periphery is whoever they are, Chinese, African, so forth and so on. There is a part, I don't know, do you have anything before 277? There's a part on 277 that I would like to read. It kind of sums up how Hearts in Dixie and Hallelujah, which I think is really important.
Yeah, go ahead. I mean, there's, just for people following along, there's some really good stuff even in between that. There's just so much. I don't want to. Yeah, we're gonna have to skip over some things, but
yeah, like there's so much in this chapter. I mean, and we're not just saying it because we're being lazy. Like there's just so much. Like you probably have to do two. If you want to do it like a point by point, we have to do multiple episodes. But in this part in the top, in each of the Black musicals, the pathetic condition of Black laborers was represented through the narrative convention of privileging the plight of one Black family. The films inferred a rural Black society was society wasted not by the crushing exploitation of peonage, but by a fateful natural poverty. Audiences were assured that cotton production generated no actual riches from the vantage point of those deposited on the level of the soil and the plant. Poverty was as much an aspect of the nature of cotton as itself. And since slavery, peonage, racial oppression, and segregation were entirely absent from the film, no recognizable history, no specific economic system, no identifiable social order had relegated Black to the bottom rung of Southern agriculture. Hearts in Dixie and Hallelujah were ethnography seasoned with melodrama, minstrelsy performed with interludes of pathos. I think that's a wonderful piece there. Why? Partly, he's just succinctly showing why Hearts in Dixie and Hallelujah are pieces that we should be celebrating. But what I think he also does really is expose what I think becomes a naturalism within the American film project, which is to make things be natural. So poverty is natural. These things that people do, they don't have large contributing value to the imperial project. If there is an imperial project even at all, they won't even acknowledge that. And, because then what you also can do is if you create a Black character who then like overcomes them, they can do the whole like they're supernatural, right? If poverty is natural for a Black person, right, it means that the natural state of a Black person is one to be impoverished. So those special Black people who get over poverty, we must look at them as supernatural, closer to white, so forth. I mean, it makes me think of OJ, right? It's OJ running. And what do they say in the doc, right? Man, he seemed white to me, right? Like the one guy who says that to him because of OJ's, and it's totally a comment to OJ's success, right? And his successful nature. He becomes white to these people, which is just a fascinating psychological break right there for a human to have.
Yeah, and he's also someone who kind of promoted that himself, to not to say
100%.
white, but to say like, I don't see color kind of thing, or like that, this, I mean, even like Morgan Freeman does this in interviews and stuff like, Lil Wayne does it to some degree, I mean, it's just interesting. The people that I think most people would be like, what are you talking about? I mean, Morgan Freeman has played some great, performances of Black people experiencing oppression, resisting, and all of that, and it's kind of fascinating that when interviewed by folks like Larry King or whatever, they would kind of present this like, does race really even matter anymore sort of discussion.
Yeah, I have to say, because I know a little bit about Morgan Freeman, and I can't really let on how I know. Someone that who I was one of my mother's friends, I'll just say that, was very close to him. He either is lying in these moments and he's not telling the full truth and he's saying what he wants to say so he could keep his job, or because people don't know about Morgan Freeman. Morgan Freeman had a very rough career for a long time, and he struggled. When he got out of that struggle session, that struggle zone of life, did he just change? But I don't think so. I think he knows it. He's read too much. He was involved with too many of these radical black plays and radical black theater. He was in shit like The Mighty Gents by William, like totally, I'm like, homie, you don't believe that. You just know saying it on Larry King is going to keep your job in line.
Right.
Keep
Yeah,
going.
it's a PR thing to a certain, and I think it was with OJ too. I mean, I think that,
100%.
yeah. Anyway,
Well, yeah, because you see OJ after all the comments he's saying about blackness and whiteness, you're like, oh wow, you ain't stupid. You're crazy, but you're not stupid. So what else is what do we have after here?
I'll skip ahead a little bit, but I think that one of the things that comes up, he talks about the reviews. I don't think we need to go into the reviews per se, but there's a section here that I'm going to pull up real quick, which is just the issue of ethnographic authenticity so frequently asserted in these reviews is interesting here because it implied historical accuracy. None of the critics appeared distressed or even mindful of the fact that the film depicted a postbellum era at odds with D.W. Griffith's mega hit Birth of a Nation barely 14 years earlier. Here, there were blacks apparently at peace with their station in the place of the grotesque, marauding brutes which occupied Dixon and Griffith's. Hearts in Dixie proposed that there had been no post-war onslaught against the old system. Now free ex-slaves solemnly rededicated themselves to servility, even in the absence of masters, seeking their accustomed and natural level. Again, natural, naturalizing all of this. He does. We could talk a little bit about this. There's a kind of back and forth. So he says even black cultural pundits Elaine Locke and Sterling Brown, both very famous folks, also have come up earlier in this book, praising the film as the truest picturization of Negro life to date, and terming Stephen Fetchett's Gummy as true as instinct itself, a vital projection of the folk manner, a real child of the folk spirit. But not everyone agreed. And then he goes into Zora Neale Hurston, who is trained as an anthropologist under Boas, who I think actually, if we remember back to like the first one, was one of the racist anthropologists who then, I believe, kind of recanted. Like, I think he's one of the ones who shifted from like race science to like disagreeing with it, but I could be wrong about that. Folks should check me on that if that's not true. But she, did a bunch of ethnography, did a bunch of work and a black folklore project, and of course is the author of Their Eyes Were Watching God. And there's a book of hers, Barracoon, that was found and published basically a couple years ago. So anyway, she basically, it says, documented a vibrant culture far removed from the quaint existence impersonated by Muse and Perry. Now in an act of resistance, she took to task the more senior black literati who participated in the spectacle. She publicly rejected their certifications of approval for Hearts and Dixie and Hallelujah as displays of disingenuous conceits and ignorance. Quote, their truth is the Negro leaders who champion the Negro's cause at so much per champ don't know the Negro themselves, so flattered by white attention that they actually believed that they were authorities on Negro religion, and so anyways.
Yeah. She basically says it's a betrayal, right? Like it's a betrayal of black culture. And yeah, it's pretty impressive. Elaine Locke is interesting. I don't really want to get into him right now, but Isaac Julian, he recently did a film about Elaine Locke. And it's actually it's an installation film. It was at one of the only interesting things at the Whitney Biennial last year, which is often just an awful showcase of things. I have to just say it. Many people agree with me, but one of the things about Locke that I find interesting is he kind of fell into, I think, these kind of idealist traps of ethnography in a way that he thought was supportive, right? So he was always into like the primitivisms and these things. So I'm glad Robinson adds this little piece of him in here because, like, and I think Laylock did a lot of amazing things as well, but there's some deep criticisms of him, and I like that Robinson has weaved him in there for a little bit of a dig.
Yeah, I mean, they're very important figures in the development of Black studies and Black scholarship as well. I mean, I I may be a little bit off on this, but I believe they may have been both teachers of E. Franklin Fraser, who of course wrote the book on the Black
That would
bourgeoisie.
not be a surprise to me at all.
They were both at Howard. I know
Yeah.
that. And anyway, yeah, so and I think that Robinson deals with their stuff appropriately throughout this book. There are some times in earlier chapters where I think he's like, yeah, they have a point here, and then there are times where he's like, yeah, they're just wrong about
It's
this.
just wrong.
And I think,
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah.
And he also does the same with Hurston, by the way. There's a point later on in this chapter where he actually takes her to task.
Yeah.
After like raising
which
her up
is
here,
very fair, which I think is a very, very, very fair critique on his part of Zora.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Where do we want to go next?
So I skipped a bunch of this
Me too.
until like 290. I think maybe to the end. I think to the end of it. I mean, to tell people what it is he kind of goes into Hearts and Dixie and Hallelujah more, with a more forensic kind of lens, and it's great. It's really dope. I don't think we should go through it. It's great to read.
There's one quote here I want to read just because it's kind of classic Robinson. So this is on 287. He says, without the slightest sympathetic gesture towards Hall, he's again talking about these different, critics and stuff like that. Lusk characterized the film as a marvelous portrayal of Negro psychology, neither sublimating nor ridiculing the superstitions, religion, sensuality, music, and optimism inherent. And then he puts in brackets, oops, in all members of the race, right? And there's just like these great moments, and he'll do some stuff earlier I'll bring into where he always loves to like just point out like, oh, this is actually racist right here, like, and then but especially the essentializing, which again I think is such an interesting thing because Robinson has sometimes been critiqued himself for essentializing, which I think is just a really bad read. But he goes into, there's this other part where he'll say people are constitutionally disposed to doing things, right? And I think that that's such a great, and he's always talking about individuals when he's saying that, and he will give like rationalization of why he thinks they're constitutionally disposed. But I think that's a funny play of him between like this idea of something being an essence of like a whole group of people versus like something that people are do because of how they see the world and how they've been raised and so on, right? And I think that's where I think the idea of essentialism and Robinson really breaks down, is that what he's really talking about is like culture and kind of what people learn, like behavior. It's not just like because this person is this or because this, that they are these things and they will always do these things. It's actually thinking about what are the material conditions, objective and subjective, that produce these people into who they are.
Yeah, and it goes back to his rejection of these pieces trying to create things like natural poverty or a naturalism of a certain disposition or a certain position in existence, right? So there is this long final part in this section. I don't know if I want to read the whole thing, or maybe I should. I don't know, but there is like really the last the last long line that I think is really important. Is that he says, not coincidentally, the overwhelming majority of Black representations were employed in genres implicated in imperialism, colonialism, or white supremacy. So I think that's just important to kind of point out that I think a lot of times when we're thinking about like the racist caricatures in films of Black people, and not just Black people, I mean, Asian people. Well, Asians are different because they wouldn't let Asians play themselves. They would have whites do it, which he talks about when we get to Charlie Chan. Um, but let's just say with Black folks is that there's a way that we say, like, movies were like these kind of normal things. They just had racist elements. Rather than Robinson really situates it in saying that these are things of imperialism, colonialism, and white supremacy, and Black representation was employed within it. I think the changing of that kind of thought process is like super important in how we view these kinds of works, and works in general. Because if you think about, you have a representation within an imperial project, then you have to ask, well, what good is representation at all? It isn't, right? And how could it be any different? And I think that's a great kind of reframing and a re-lensing of everything. And I think it can even help us today look at movies and cultural production in I think in important ways.
Yeah, so I'm just gonna touch on something real quick at the end, not go into detail on it, but he does make this comment, this piece about Nina Mae McKinney. Um,
Yes,
and basically she's the star, if I'm not wrong, of Hallelujah, or one of the key
I
figures
think
in
it's
it.
Hallelujah.
Yeah, I think
Hmm.
so. And I'll show a picture of her for folks just to give an idea. But he's making the point that she's dark skinned by standards of films in this day for a leading lady, basically, and not to be playing like a mammy or something like that. And so he has some commentary on this that I'm gonna share because I think it's good, and it also um it 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 brings in some other points that I want to touch on with Robinson's thinking. But so McKinney's chick, that's the character in the film, would prove to be an anomaly in American films for the next decade or more. McKinney's performances, for example, would consist of characters relegated to the Caribbean by major studios, whether American or British. He gives Caribbean and even minstrelsy. That's important to include, but he puts a bunch of films in there. She was accorded some range only in Black cast films like Black Network, and produced by Poverty Row Studios in the 1930s and destined for Black audiences. For major studios, there was simply no place for the historical and social complexities signified by an actress like McKinney in their constructions of race and their representations of American life during the Great Depression. The onset of Depression was marked by a cycle of enlightened treatments of race as occurred after World War II. Sorry, was not marked. That's important. Yeah, it was not marked by a cycle of enlightened treatments of race as occurred after World War II. Indeed, the lords of the world system were in quite a different frame of mind. And I partly read that because I think this piece on the lords of the world system, we're doing the discussion around Amin and Robinson, just to remind folks, spent I don't know how many years at SUNY Binghamton, working with the Braudel Center, which is where Emmanuel Wallerstein and I forget the other guy's name, but they were developing world systems theory. And a lot of Black Marxism is actually in part a dialogue with the world systems theorists. But he he also read Samir Amin's work, and there's annotated copies of Amin essays and stuff like that in his house. And anyway, I just point that out, and the world system comes up a few different times here, but he is thinking about core and periphery. He's obviously thinking about imperialism, and he doesn't shy away from that language or in understanding the film industry, as we'll get to, especially as we go on, as like really under the control of big capital.
Yeah, I want to say, so I watched a little bit of Hallelujah, and it's weird. So I was watching, because she's definitely the most, is it McKinney, right, is her name, right? She's the most like dynamic and performer in the film. She's very much the centerpiece. But there is a way you could tell that they play with her skin that makes you, it's like you realize that she's not as dark as she is kind of being kind of shaded to be. So there's almost like this acknowledgement that she's like sticking out of everything. And it's very weird. It's a very weird experience. I mean, she's a very dynamic performer, but then also there's a way that she's like constantly separate from it all. It's a very weird way to watch a film. I couldn't watch the whole thing. I ended up like cutting through pieces, and it was a very strange experience. And I think Robinson helped ground me. Yeah, what even says how like she you know, they were like people try to impersonate in various ways and do different things. It's very weird. I mean, I can't really speak on it as detailed. I'd love to go back through it at some point on my own, but it's a really interesting section, and she's a really interesting figure. And like to watch the movie and to read that, I think it could be really good.
Yeah, right on. All right. So the next section is called The Counterfeit of the Golden Age. Let's see. What do I have here? So yeah, sound and capital. So like, yeah, this first section is important. I don't know if you want to go into it or I can.
Yeah. I'll read this first little part. I mean, I don't know if you want to read even more than that. He says, the advent of sound completed the conversion of the major studios from independents to subsidiaries of the dominant capitalist conglomerates in the United States. So that's just a great like stomping of like what this is. And it actually reminds me of something, and I might have mentioned it here before, but Sergei Eisenstein in what year? 1929 or 28, he wrote a joint essay with two other filmmakers about what the coming of the sound era. And what he says in it is that he saw it as having the potential to basically do kind of imperial work, right? I mean, one of the lines he says is, I'll read it, is, will a certain epoch of its automatic utilization for highly cultured dramas and other photograph performances of a theatrical sort. So he has a lot of overlap, and I'm sure Robinson has read it as well, because you're talking about how when you get the sound in sync and then you can create these kind of representations of the world, you'll make these kind of highly cultured or culturally representative pieces. These are what happens. Like they tried to do that with silent films, but they just didn't have the weight because you couldn't have talking. It didn't feel natural. Now you'll begin to create these kind of natural isms because you can do sound sync and you can kind of make a world that feels multi-sensory. So this will actually be the world. And he saw a lot of danger in that. I mean, he at the top of it, he mentions Germany, which I find very prescient on Eisenstein's way, because he's talking about like, look, the Germans are doing this. They're in a rush to do with this. And look, who are the people who used it? You know, German fascists. And we'll get to fascism also pretty soon, also with another guy. But yeah. And there's more on right after.
Is this this footnote here, is this what you're referring to also? Because he talks about agitprop films for social reorganization. Oh, he says that polarized Sergei Eisenstein and Ziga Vertov.
Yeah.
Revolutionary. Yeah.
Anyway. Which is,
it might be a different
I think it's slightly different, but it is interesting to bring those two in because Eisenstein and Vertov were very critical of sound. They didn't like it. They thought it would actually, what is this, popular films? Yeah, they didn't. They had a lot of concerns with what it would do to film as a medium of the imagination, and basically is making it into a propaganda force for capitalist and imperialist interests. You know, well, maybe they were right. Those good old Soviets. You know, where else? So yeah, I mean, there's more on the neck right after. Do you want to go into that at all?
Yeah, a little bit. So, so he talks about that. You know, again, just the sentence after that, it talks about how the transition from independence to dominant capitalist conglomerates, the change was rather quick and quite public. So it is rather startling that so few film historians have registered it. On the contrary, most American film histories concerned with this era are premised on the imaginary golden age, in quotes, of American movie making, when dictatorial studio heads and their key minions drew up production schedules, imposed managerial agendas, inscribed moral standards, and tyrannized talents. This myth was the official story. And he talks about this, but he also goes on to say, it's in film hagiographies, etc. It's not true, but it did serve. It yielded the real rulers of American motion pictures from discovery, publicity, and criticism in their space, where the Zukors, the Mayers, the Goldwins, the Warners, the Lemels, and so on, that is prominent and for the most part foreign-born Jews, vulnerable to anti-Semitic campaigns and thus eminently compliant to whatever the cultural and ideological needs of their overlords might be. I appreciated that also because it's just like a really nice inversion of the typical anti-Semitic, thing that you get about Jews controlling Hollywood. It's really like, no, capital controlled it, but it was useful to capital to have Jews in charge of these studios, because then if people didn't like what they were doing, they would be open to charges of anti-Semitism, right? So it's like a very interesting,
That's so
commentary here.
wicked. That's so wicked. Like, it's a wicked thing to do. It's like, all right, we're gonna do all this. We're gonna put the Jews in front. No
Yeah,
one likes them anyway. Like it's just so wicked. And yeah, I appreciate that too, especially because he's taking out the official story, because this is how you're taught, and this is how all the stuff is taught, that it was this place, this factory that was kind of separated from the world projects. It was a golden land. And I think even people, even when like they talk about like like women's presence in early Hollywood, they want to speak about it as evidence that Hollywood is good, and they'll invoke that, and it's Robinson does a good intervention here.
yeah. I'm gonna read just a little bit more on this page. Well, probably quite a bit more, but
I know what you're talking about. This is good stuff too. Yeah.
yeah, spurred by the financial and organizational opportunities presented by World War I, American capitalists had aggressively expanded into the controlling heights in the world market. During the first 2 decades of the 20th century, military adventures had brought areas of the Pacific, the Philippines, and the Caribbean, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Haiti into the fledgling empire. And the logic of imperialism would inspire similar expeditions to Central America, Panama, Nicaragua, and Mexico, and Asia, China. The war had also instigated the technical development of broadcast equipment and simultaneously brought the control of that technology into the hands of a few corporations: Westinghouse, General Electric, AT&T, and the United Fruit Company. In the post-war era, these interests had incorporated as the Radio Corporation of America, RCA. Of course, their financial and technical resources dwarfed the movie industry. Consequently, when the production of sound film required access to their patents and equipment, and when the industry's theater conversions required massive infusions of capital, the giants consumed the dwarfs, transforming the American film industry into an adjunct, a subsidiary of the multinationals. For years to come, the major decisions about American films would be made in the corporate boardrooms of New York-based investment houses and banks.
So I have to say that was very helpful, because it actually corrected me on something that I had been thinking for a long time. So one of the points that I had made about some of the problems with film today is how much the tech industry runs the movie business now, with the advent of digital cameras and digital technology. So companies like Red and then Ari's conversion into digital, though because Ari was around before with cameras, film cameras. Sony, Fuji, so forth and so on. Fuji, not really. Fuji still in the film. That's wrong. So I had made this kind of point, but honestly, when I read that, I was like, oh no, it's always been controlled by tech and capital or technology or just big capital or however we frame big capital for this moment. And it was a correction for me because but then it makes more sense. It makes more sense how someone like in the 90s, Lucas was able to kind of do this kind of project with big tech to make digital cameras because they were already there, right? They were just looking for the new thing.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's a really good, so many good sections, but that passage is great.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about, so there's the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, or
Yeah.
MPPDA,
Yeah.
and then Hayes is an important figure here. And
Yeah.
this is where we're getting into, the codes and censorship and all this kind of stuff on a more formalized scale.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about Hayes earlier. He brings in, and Hayes is famous for the Hayes Code. William Harrison Hayes. One thing before it, I was a cool like writing thing that Robinson does is he brings back people. So he brings back Jack Johnson again for a real quick thing, and he talks about how Congress enacted a law prohibiting the interstate exhibition of boxing films, and this was after Jack Johnson's, film about defeating, the white boxer. So it constituted a threat to white supremacy, as he writes in here, and I just find that hilarious. It's like you got this video of Jack Johnson whipping some white dude's ass, and they're just
and he said, I remember him saying it was like one of the most watched films before Birth of a Nation too. So yeah,
it was like I was like getting this image in my head of them losing their mind and going to Congress. It's great. So you know what I'm saying? They're like, no, they're just like losing it. It's just really, really hilarious. So he talks about some stuff about like various things that were beginning to happen. One of the things he does in here that I like, it's like a kind of thing that's implicit and that he puts within, is how chaotic movie making was. So you had you have like the coming of also of mass media. So you're having like stars going through shit. So like scandals are happening, and they basically needed to deal with this. So in 1922, the studios combined to form a central public relations agency. The Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America Incorporated, the MPPDA. To head the MPPDA, the bosses of the big studio chose William Harrison Hayes. Hayes was now Postmaster General of the new Republican administration under President Warren Harding. This is a great part. Hayes and Harding were from Indiana, coincidentally the state with the most active Ku Klux Klan organization. And though Harding was president, Hayes was probably the more powerful of the two. Which he doesn't, he does, I guess, get into it. I'd be curious to dig into that, like I can see how, but I'd be curious like why that happened to a certain degree. So Hayes had been in charge of the political machinery requisite for Harding's political emergence and his eventual election as president. So you got this guy who's just a major power player in politics around the, in national politics. And he becomes the boss of this Motion Picture Producer and Distributors of America organization, which I think shows you how important this is to them. Go ahead.
Yeah, and it's now like this is now the Motion Picture Association. Like it became that. And it's, if you just look up, it's like an American trade association representing the 5 major film studios of the United States, the mini major Amazon MGM studios, as well as video streaming service Netflix and Amazon Prime.
It still exists. And
they do the ratings. They're the people who now determine like what your film is rated.
Yeah. And I'll say a point about that once we go through some more of this, because like this to me also exposes, I think, the lie of America not being a censorship nation. And as much as they love to haggle over the Soviet Union's censorship and China's censorship and such and such, but we can get into that. I mean, they brought a colonel to be the representative of Europe, like a military guy, right? He was a military aide to the White House. I mean, he's dealing with movies, you know, like, come on, right? I mean, it shows you how important. I want to read this one part on 293. The original charge of Hayes was to defend the industry from regulation already imposed by several states and municipalities and beat down the crescendo of demands for federal regulation of the movie industry. Hayes' strategy was to embrace a legion of civil organizations whose representatives under the authority of the MPPDA would review completed films and provide certificates of good moral standing. Those films found wanting would be returned to the studios for revisions, and then the MPPDA certification would be granted. It was, however, the ambiguous station of the MPPDA's function, the increasing interest of big capital in the movie industry, and the energies and ambitions of Hayes, Joy, Heron, and others, which would fashion the agency into a central administration of American movie making. The MPPDA had begun as a public relations adjunct to the studios, but shortly afterward, the studios themselves lost their autonomy, trading away their independence for infusions of capital, presumably an advantage in their mutual competition, or finally bargaining for access to sound technology and equipment. Since self-deception can be boundless, it's a bit tragic that many of the studio bosses counted themselves fortunate that they were permitted the illusion of autonomy. This, to me, totally just destroys the idea that American film was ever developed in a way that was not totally driven by capital, the imperialist framework, whatever residues of other kinds of weird ideas, good moral standing, whether it's Christian, enlightenment, throw whatever you want. It's all been infused. I mean, look, the Hayes Code, when he put those codes in, which we talked about in another episode, those lasted for decades after, right? I mean, there's a lot of debate of how much they were acknowledged or ignored after a certain point, but they were still there. And because they became guiding rails of how people were to think about movie making. So the guiding rails of American movie making are largely based on this guy, his relationship to capital, the deals that these studios made so they could basically get their movies made.
Yeah. And there's all kinds of weird stuff in it. But I remember my father even talking about this with who he's like, like that. I remember for him, he was like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Spoiler alert if you haven't seen this movie, but he was like, they had to be killed in the end because you couldn't allow a film in which people would successfully rob banks and escape to South America.
Right. Like not happening, right? Not happening at all. And I just, so it's like when people go out and they read their like Sid Field or Robert McGee, these are guys who tell you how to write screenplays, and they're drawing from a lot of these films. I'm just like, you do realize this diagnostic of how to make movies is coming from a very imperialist mind frame. I mean, to me, but this is all the problem with America and people who still want to like throw John Locke in my face and tell me I need to read parts of Locke to understand the greatness of Western society and the things that we need to acknowledge.
We read John Locke to talk about how horrible he was here.
Yes, exactly. And how, we have prisons largely because of shit that he thought, It's like, come on, dude. Oh, man. I mean, there's so much in here. The MPPDA. Yeah, one of the other parts that I found interesting was, so there began like foreign backlash.
Yeah.
To representation of it. Because they had a lot of foreign distribution. It accounted for some like 30% of American industry revenues. This alone was an impressive achievement, but in many foreign markets, the volume of American film exhibitions simply swamped national production. So it actually became a big thing. So there was like an issue with like the British, French, and Germans where they weren't able to compete. And I think it's just important to like think about movies have always existed within a capitalist framework. At least in the West, they were doing different things in other places, but this is like you're dealing with movies in a capitalist system. So how that kind of shapes everything.
They're also banning these movies because
Yeah.
they're like racist against them, basically.
And that's the other part. So then there was like this thing with like Mexico, right? Moreover, first in Mexico and Germany, France, and even Britain, concerns were being raised about the characterizations of their nationals in American films. So like then they were also just like, this shit is just whack, right? And what you're doing. Yeah, like they Mexico officially banned American films. So then Hayes had to send a representative to resolve it. So then he goes to this really interesting part, and I'm going to read this part, which just gets deep, because then what it leads to. I remember when I read this, I was like, "Oh, this is interesting," and then where it ended on the other end, I was like, "Well, oh shit." The most egregiously hateful stereotypes of foreigners were reserved for Germans, targeted by propaganda efforts of the Allies during the war, World War I. Germans were the most frequent foreign villains in the Hollywood melodramas and comedies. Despite the fact that the German market for American film was comparatively modest, the United Kingdom accounted for 30.5%, Hollywood's foreign revenues, Australia 50. I'll skip that, all these numbers. Hollywood responded to Germany's concerns. Not too surprisingly, in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, Russian villains were substituted for German villains. Notwithstanding the fact that a disproportionate number of studio bosses were from families with roots in Eastern and Central Europe, there was very little sympathy among them for the Russian Revolution. International labor championed communism. Consequently, the Russian Revolution was perceived as a threat to American capitalism, now the most powerful center of the world system. On the other hand, Italian fascism had few detractors in Hollywood. Fascism was capital's response to communism, and some powerful Americans even conspired to orchestrate a fascist revolution against Franklin during Roosevelt's administration. I think many people probably know that story. I'm sure he's talking about the Smedley Butler plot with was it Bush's grandfather? Was one of them? I think, if I remember correctly. Isn't it George?
He may have been.
Or Harem,
Yeah.
or is it? Yeah, it's with Brown Brothers Harriman. I think it was one of it was people from there. But I'm sure that's what Robinson is. But then, so this we'll go to the next part in a minute. But like, I found this fascinating. I was not surprised by the communist hate and the need to kind of go into communism, but I did not realize that Italian fascism had such support within it. So in the earlier days of American capital's affection for fascism, Hayes was quite pleased with that his personal intervention had facilitated the filming in Italy of Samuel Goldwyn's homage to Italian fascism, The Eternal City. I tried to find this film. Coincidentally, it's mostly lost. There's like maybe like I think I said like 30 minutes of it are around, and everything I found did not talk about it in the way Robinson did. But I'll continue. We made a picture that pleased Italy, pleased Mussolini himself, and we told the story of Italy as Italy would have what it would have it told, that all other nations might understand it. In 1927, Moses Koenigsberg, president of Hearst International News Service and Universal Service, met with Mussolini and enthused. I think that Mussolini is the busiest man in Europe and told him so. Koenigsberg was echoing the admiration his boss had displayed for Mussolini since 1922. It was a sentiment all shared by Millicent Hearst, the boss's wife, who published flattering articles on Mussolini in 1930. From 1927 well into the 1930s, Mussolini was a regular paid feature writer for the Hearst newspapers. Mussolini had admirers like Hearst sprinkled throughout the American film industry. I mean, it goes. We'll skip a little bit till we get to his films. I don't know if there's anything you want to add in that little part, but
just quickly, that Goldwyn, of course, is part of MGM, and he's also a European-born Jew. He's also a Zionist, and so and Robinson has this piece in the collected volume, which is behind me, and about Zionist support for Italian fascism. And
wow.
Anyway, there's more to it than he can go into here, and he actually, I think, references the piece in one of his footnotes here. But just to say, like, there's even more that could be gone into here, and he does other places. So yeah, just layers of people to think about that,
Yeah.
of this Zionist's, head of a film studio, doing a lot of work for propaganda for Mussolini, and then obviously where World War II ends up going and so on. But
Yeah.
yeah.
So on the next page, on the top of 296, I mean, we have to then culminate and show that in 1927, Hearst Newsreel Service, as part of a consortium including MGM and Gaumont, signed an exchange agreement with Luce, Italy's largest film organization. Thus, while MPPDA censors closely monitored films to ensure that no communist messages might leach into scripts, the big studios routinely produce films like Columbia's Mussolini Speaks or Man of Courage, celebrating fascism. So I could not find Mussolini Speaks. I looked really hard. And Man of Courage, the 1934. I could not find them. I'm sure there's ways to find them, but I did a pretty basic search. But this to me, destroys any kind of these you always see the images of the old Soviet and Eastern Bloc countries, picking through films. And I'm not saying it didn't happen, but this idea that it was a free market here and there was this free stuff, when they actively and for a long time said anything that would have any kind of good energy towards communism, cut that out. But fascism, oh yeah. And it's funny. Jared, did you see when people were sharing out right after Trump got elected, this anti-fascist movie clip all over Instagram?
I don't know.
It
No, I don't think I did.
It became a thing. People were sharing. I think they did it in 2016 too. There was this anti-fascist propaganda, or pro-America film that they did about we need to smash fascism during the war, and they would share a clip from it. And I was I think I wrote in a comment, yeah, but y'all should show Mussolini Speaks. Because this acting like America has always been this really hard-nosed country in opposition to fascism is totally ahistorical. Hollywood proves it. It literally proves it, I mean, this last part is really great. I don't know. Should we read it? This last part of the section?
Yeah, we should.
You could read it.
At least part of it, yeah.
Yeah, it is great.
Yeah, so he says when the war, this is World War I he's talking about here, propelled American capitalists to dominance at the core of the world system, the rule of capital was at a critical political juncture. The Russian Revolution had profoundly altered international relations in the West and wherever European powers claimed primacy. Never before in its history had the capitalist world system encountered a state dedicated to the abolition of private property and the championing of workers. In the Soviet Union, the Bolshevik Party seized on these socialist ideals as its raison d'etre, promoting revolutionary movements far beyond the old Russian Empire. Anyway, he talks, there's more great stuff he says here, and he does talk about, basically the leading of, anti-colonial insurrections and so on. But I think one of the things I want to say too is that, I think Robinson often, because of some of the critical work he's doing around Marxism in Black Marxism and in the anthropology of Marxism, he's kind of, some people I think really misunderstand also his dedication to socialism and to working class revolution too, which I think comes through in texts like this and others, that he's like, look, the Soviet Union was doing all this, and so these capitalists were like, we need fascism to combat this, in the US as well. And anyway, I think it's just important for people to understand about how Robinson thought. He was an anti-imperialist and he was a socialist, and he was pro the emancipation of all the peoples of the world, including the working class. You're muted, I think.
Yeah, sorry, I moved my thing. One thing I did do in my Google looking for Mussolini Speaks, it made in that year $1 million, which I don't know what that is for inflation now, but that's a seriously profitable movie. $1 million in 33. That's pretty heavy.
Yeah. There's also, I mean, he doesn't go into it here, but there was also a good history of American capitalists supporting Nazis in different ways too, like up until and even in some instances through the World War. So, you know, but
Yeah. Cool.
all right. Well, we
So
can kind of jump ahead probably to the next section unless there's anything else you wanted in this.
No,
Yeah.
we can go totally into the wonderful world of jungle films.
Yeah. So this is a very interesting section. It's called American Imperialism and the Jungle Film Genre. Yeah, I mean, where do you want to start on this?
I mean, he has a couple of nice like little one-liners that I liked early. He said, the jungle film, this is really is a one-liner. The jungle film fashioned the present and the quite distant past into a racial pageant, which I find that like a really succinct way of thinking about what that is, and as like a kind of overarching thought, right? Because when you look at things that we both looked a little bit at Trader Horn, which we'll talk about, and say that's totally what it is, right? It's like this like weird like pageant. But we can go to the top of it. So he names a bunch of films that he'll talk about in various degrees. Like he brings in Emperor Jones, which he's going to talk about later, Imitation of Life, which he doesn't really get into, I think, that deeply in it. I don't know if he talks about Green Pastures at all, actually, now that I think about it. But he brings in these
but
films.
It's brief, but he does
brief,
talk
right? Yeah. So he wrote these films were, of course, he's talking about them being like all black casts and all black themed films, right? So there's like these like big all black cast and all black themed films, and you have films like Hallelujah, Hearts of Dixie, right? But there was also a development of another kind of genre at the same time called the jungle genre, right?
Yeah, I can pull in. I mean, Covington. This part is
the Covington
good.
part. Yeah.
He says, writing in 1929 and concentrating on the use of thousands of black extras, quote unquote, in working in Hollywood, Covington had reported that most were employed to create atmosphere in jungle, South Sea Island, and African scenes as natives, warriors, and the like. Covington was not ungenerous, so he did acknowledge that, quote, others are employed to do individual roles or parts, such as mammy types, and their names are included with the other principals in their respective pictures. Covington was reporting something which was now more apparent, that the plantation genre was and also ran, for in sheer numbers, savages, natives, warriors predominated.
Yeah.
Covington's subject was, of course, what is now referred to as the jungle genre. The two genres should not have been seen as been in competition. It was more like each required its own space to enact its report on black nullity. The jungle film fashioned the present and quite distant past into a racial pageant. The plantation genre policed the civic body and domestic labor. The jungle film patrolled the frontier. And like distinct organs of state violence, the genres collaborated in general and differed in particulars. He goes on to more. There's just great, but it's, basically to get to the bottom of this, he connects it to settler colonialism. He says a colonial ambition had been a part of the origins of the United States in the late 18th century. The nations frontiered had christened their assembly the Continental Congress, thus announcing their intention to colonize lands west of the Appalachian Mountains, a land of savages. And so, yeah, I mean, he goes into a bunch of stuff. He cites Ward Churchill,
Mm-hmm.
and then he talks also, of course, about what's going on in the period. So he brings in Hawaii, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Santo Domingo, Haiti, um, Nicaragua, Colombia, and other lands were subjected to American military or economic domination. Inevitably, certain sectors of American corporate and financial interests were reconfigured to exploit the broadened vistas of American power. He goes into this thing on American Hawaiian Steamships Company, which I don't know that we need to go through, but
No.
a really fascinating discussion here about kind of the period in which capitalism really gets fast tracked in the United States. He goes through
Mm-hmm.
like how many companies were capitalized over $10 million from like one period to the next and how much that grew. Goes into how big the railroads were in the early period. And then, he uses this American Hawaii Steamship Company to talk about these connections. He says the corporate entity of here, I will bring up just a little bit more of this to say. Uh, a corporate entity of Flint and Company, Williams, Diamond and Company, National Sugar Refining Company, and eventually H.G. Lappin and Company was founded in 1899. And by the onset of World War I, the company owned something like 25% of the deadweight tonnage under U.S. registration, based on the then novel idea of using ships powered by steam to transport freight between Hawaii and the States. And between the East and West coasts, the company was capitalized by powerful banking interests: National City Bank, Hanover
Mm-hmm.
National, and National Park Bank in New York, Old Colony Trust in Boston, and Bank of California in San Francisco. Among manufacturers employed by American Hawaiian were Union Iron in San Francisco, Roach Shipyard, Maryland Steel, and among its partners were the U.S. government, Panama Railroad. He goes in and talks about their relationship to the annexation of Hawaii, the de-development of I would mess that up, Isthmus Railroad, and the Panama Canal. So anyways, and then he talks about their chief partner being the U.S. Navy and this juncture between capital and military, so he just
Yeah.
uses it as an example of what's going on with imperialism and capitalism at the time.
Yeah. One thing, just to kind of button the style of the jungle film a little bit, he says is he talks about how like in the plantation genre there was like this counterfeit black speech, right? And he said that it provided evidence to the viewer that like the Negro brain was small because they couldn't like get this like proper speech once they got here. But then like the jungle film almost goes like worse, because like in the jungle film there was no black language, right? The savage speech inhabited a proto-linguistic realm somewhat approximating rudimentary semaphores of insect colonies. I mean, the jungle films constituted the savage of the jungle film was simply a part of the fauna. And when you see Trader Horn, it's totally like that. Like they're kind of like in the walls. It's almost like Alien, right? How like remember like an Alien, I don't know if the second Aliens where they come out the walls, right? I mean, it's so rancid, these representations. And yeah, that's something that I think is a really good button to have. Yeah, I mean, yeah, on that part. I'm trying to think of else.
Yeah. So I guess to say a little bit about some of these, I mean, he has a quote. Let me see if I can find it on um, Africa being a place without history,
Yeah.
which is later on.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he goes into Haiti and the
Yeah.
receivership created there, then the military occupation. He goes into rubber and Liberia and creating a receivership in the Liberian government. I mean, it's like I said this to you yesterday as we were talking about, like the whole book is like a history of imperialism through
Mm-hmm.
a period of time with like, he goes on these pieces where he's just like breaking down all of this stuff about, imperialism and how they're getting resources from the periphery to the core.
Yeah.
And you know, and then he's like, okay, this is why they were making these films. You
Well,
know,
yeah, I mean, and that is, it goes back to like what I would reading with How to Read Donald Duck. I mean, this is, they need a narrative and they need a convincing reason, whether it's these people are backwards, these are resources that they're not utilizing correctly, or it's not even doing anything at all. Like, we're not actually stealing. It's just part of the natural flow and evolution of culture. And, you know, a lot of liberals, even liberals on the left, like to say this thing of, you know, raising people up to a higher standard by getting them involved in the American project. So it's that same kind of mentality, and they need these kinds of narratives to do it. I mean, do you want to talk about Teddy Roosevelt at all? I know he brings him up in it briefly. I don't necessarily want to go too deep in that. Like, I do think it's really important because, I mean, Roosevelt, with like the Rough Riders and all these types of things, I think are just really important histories about what he did, but also the kind of mentality, and that Roosevelt kind of mentality becomes something that gets extended into these kinds of narratives, right? He has this line, right, in a tiny half of an island nation. I don't know if it's that one. I think it's a little bit further down. Yeah, the next page. Yeah, actually, we'll start even that one. In one small but exemplary insistence, Teddy's muscular paternalism towards colored peoples molded American policy in the Dominican Republic. So he has this stuff about what he did in DR, Teddy Roosevelt. But I think that line of muscular paternalism is really, 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 really poignant, right? Because muscular meaning that it's like a strong arm, right? But this idea that we have to lift these people out of their backwardness, right? I am your father here to kind of make you civilized, right? You are backwards. You must become something.
yeah, I mean, I just want to read this quote, which is from Roosevelt in 1901. It says, it is our duty toward the people living in barbarism to see that they are freed from their chains, and we can free them only by destroying barbarism itself. It is the duty of a civilized power to put down savagery and barbarism."
I mean, he
Right.
says it himself.
Yeah, that's just Teddy Roosevelt talking.
Exactly. You know, that's regular Saturday speech for Teddy Roosevelt, you know. And it's funny because, like, man, I remember being taught about Roosevelt when I was in school, man, and they made that shit seem like it was like some cool shit.
He created the national parks. He really cared about conservation.
Yeah, he was down there, you know, just out there, you know. They have all the pictures of him on the horses and shit. And I'm always like, oh, okay. And then I read about that as I got older. I was like,
yeah, the Rough Riders, right? Yeah,
the Rough Riders. I'm like, come on, man. Like, y'all are wild how you taught me this. And yeah, the rubber, I think the rubber stuff is really, really, really fascinating. Did I have any notes on that? No, I don't have any notes on that. That's all fascinating. I mean, he also has these like pictures that he shows. These like these really startling images of which, like, man, like I've looked at like some of the later Disney stuff that they did. It looks a lot like that. I mean, these are from the 1910s, like the pictures of how they do the savage people. It looks more or less the same. It's the same kind of like image style. Yeah. I mean, look at that. Like, that looks like, if you look at like the old Donald Duck comics or the old Mickey Mouse comics, when they go to the savage areas, that's how it's drawn. Oh, you're muted, Jared.
Sorry. Yeah, and this is like the San Francisco Chronicle and the Indianapolis Sunday Star. I'm just pointing that out to folks.
This is what, yeah.
Just
this
regular,
is your morning paper.
Sunday news. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, and you need to do that. You need to kind of create this vision of the periphery as this totally whacked out place, which is a project that America still does, and it did for a long time. I don't really have anything else until we get to the Jungle films, like 308. I have some stuff, I think, there.
Okay. Just a couple things.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, he goes into this piece about how, like, technically D.W. Griffith created the first jungle film, but then he
Yeah.
talks about how it's not really worth examining for a variety of reasons. One of the things that he there's just another little, this is one of those barbs that I wanted to share with folks. He says, though South Africa was the setting for Zulu's heart, this is the Griffith film, Griffith was constitutionally incapable of producing a film which bore any resemblance to South African realities or to the dramatic dynamics of the lives of Dinizulu or Buller. Griffith counterfeited the conflict of invasion, war, resistance, and expropriation by casting white actors in blackface and smuggling in his then recurrent theme of the loyal slave. Quote, he used a white actor in blackface and made his action the saving of a white child and her mother, end quote. African agency bedeviled British policy everywhere on that continent, but for Griffith, blacks were merely a passive canvas on which white sensibilities were illustrated. Blacks lacked the imagination or intelligence to even portray themselves. So again, like, just making sure to remind folks of who D.W. Griffith was, who obviously was the creator of Birth of a Nation. But he talks about how basically it's not a jungle film. He said for the jungle film, um,
Well, he talks about you have to start with literature. There's a couple of literature pieces which also stick out. I think it's really important,
yeah,
right? The literary forefathers of the jungle film genre
right.
were H. Rider Haggard, King Solomon's Mines, which is she, Alan Quatermain. I mean, I was raised on King Solomon's Mines and Alan Quatermain. Edgar Wallace, Sanders of the River. That one I don't know. And of course, Edgar Rice Burroughs, Tarzan of the Apes, which we'll definitely
Yeah.
be getting into. But this idea that they have these literary origins.
Yeah, they're adventure novels. I mean, also, like, he talks about it a little bit, right? Jungle Book, I think, is another, like,
Yeah.
example of this too.
It's funny. As a kid, I was never into that one. That to me was always a little off. My parents wouldn't let me watch Tarzan. They had other things that they let me watch that they shouldn't have, that were racist, but like Tarzan was like, nah. And Jungle Book to me was always just very weird, right? Anyway, digression. But there's this line on 308 that I think is really interesting, where he begins talking about Haggard and Wallace. He said, yeah, Haggard and Wallace were profoundly immersed culturally and psychologically in colonial South Africa and the production of racial oppression. Their reactions to these influences were related but different. While Haggard pursued a radical vein of racial invention, Wallace adhered rather more closely to the racial conceits which assembled and lubricated the British machinery of indirect rules. Nevertheless, the cultural impact of the ritualization of their tales exposed many in England and America to the presumption that Africa belonged to whites. We might surmise that one such convert was the young Hugh River Trevor Roper, later as an eminent British historian, inevitably advanced to Lord Calvert. Trevor Roper declared, "Perhaps in the future, there will be some African history to teach." Oh man, dude. I'm sorry. I had to pause.
Here we go, folks.
But at present, there is none. There is only the history of the Europeans in Africa. The rest is darkness, like the history of pre-European, pre-Columbian America. And darkness is not a subjective history. Please do not misunderstand me. I do not deny that men existed even in the dark countries and dark centuries, nor that they had political life and culture. Interesting to sociologists and anthropologists, but history, I believe, is essentially a form of movement and purposive movement too. I mean, there's a lot I could say about that because of, like, there's like the very obvious right-wing racism that we recognize with that. But I have to say, there's even liberal arguments that I've heard and liberal left arguments that I've heard that have the traces of that within it. And I'll leave it there. But that's, to me, that was a great find by Robinson, and I was really happy that he put it in there. But I think it's also because it's important, because then when we get into Tarzan and the rest of the jungle films, this is kind of what undergirds it. These kind of histories.
Yeah, and he says, Robinson goes on to say, given that his principal narrative was the rise of Christian Europe, it was almost axiomatic that a tale concerning the origins of one civilization, the West, would require the total negation of modernity's other. And yeah, we'll go into this more, but this is I think really important context of what he's laying out about what the jungle genres, purpose is in a cultural realm. It's to teach people this idea that sure, there are people there, but those people are more like animals than they are like us. Like, this is not civilization, this is not history. We're actually bringing them into history by going there and teaching them some things.
And this largely, and as the years went on, like, I think they were very specific early on, like Africa, Latin America, Asia, right? And then we talked about a little bit, Jared, as staying specifically that Africa was backwards became untenable, or Latin America was backwards. They just made it kind of like the savages, the general savage, right? So it's the idea of savage land, but the savages always still had the ornaments of African savagery, of Latin, Aztec or whatever savagery of old, Asian savagery. So like, it doesn't leave this idea. How we still seem to focus on savagery still has these ornaments attached to it.
I think about like Indiana Jones movies.
Yeah,
like
100%. Like the second one, Temple of Doom, really.
Yeah,
bro. And that was when my father let me watch a ton.
And like, he's supposed to be an anthropologist, right? Or is he an archaeologist? One of the other archaeologist.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's like a classic, colonial,
Oh yeah.
So it's
yeah. The second one is literally Temple of Doom. They're all that, but Temple of Doom is really explicit in this idea that I don't know if he actually says Hinduism in it. I don't know if they actually say the word. I doubt that they do.
I can't remember.
But the idea that it is a kind of prehistory culture, and that they can't, without an intermediary, Indiana Jones, from the civilized world, they can't solve their issues. Like, they have issues, Yeah, and also like their crops dying is because a rock isn't there. Not because of Western imperialism. Anyway.
Do you have anything before where do you want to go next?
We can go, do you want to go into I guess Tarzan we could go next.
So there's a little section on 311.
Oh yeah, I have that highlighted too. I didn't write a note, but I have it highlighted. We could do that too. Maybe if you want to read that.
Yeah, this will just kind of underscore the point that we're bringing. But he said imperialism required that no semblance of a native economy other than hunting or civilization would be attached to the savages. They did not farm, they did not cook or clean or read or make and wear clothing, play music, or teach their children. They possessed no religion, only superstition, and they had achieved only the barest rudiments of art or language. The world system determined that untold and untold wealth was to be found, discovered in Africa, India, and the jungles of the Americas. In the public imagination, Africa became more and more a propitious site for revealing the natural orders of race, gender, and class. And since there were no compelling claims of African domain, any agency authorized in the West, commercial, moral, political, and so forth, was licensed to exploit, cajole, or rule the continent as it deemed fit. Sampling the American press, coincident with the first jungle films, the impression was that it was slavishly publishing numerous uncorroborated accounts of self-promoting missionaries, amateur travelers, and the ever-present but influential racial bigots, which confirmed white conceits. Augmenting the popular impact of the jungle films, reports on primitive beliefs and savage practices were interspersed with eyewitness tales of exotic, uncivilized, and unnatural practices of Africa's natives. All right. So that's a good summary. He goes into a couple of different, like, he goes into the role of white women in these films, which we could talk about a little bit. And he goes into some different ways that this was kind of played with. He also talks about some of the subtleties between British representations and American representations, which is not that interesting other than, I would say, I mean, it is interesting. It's not that crucial other than the point of Robinson definitely sees more of a connection, I think, in the US of what this means vis-a-vis like segregation and racial politics within the United States, whereas in Britain it's more about just their colonial holdings in Kenya and so on, you know. And so they both have an imperial purpose, but in Robinson, like, he talks about certain figures have to be changed from one context to the other in order to make a point that's advantageous for the racial regime in the United States, basically.
Yeah, to the white woman point, I mean, there's a lot of interesting things he brought up, but I think the one that stuck out for me was the reality that Black women were largely absent, from jungle films completely, right?
Yeah,
and he has this paragraph on 312. I mean, the stuff before that is really good too, but I want to read this part on 312. So this absence of the Black woman in the jungle genre, I think it's towards the bottom. If you go, a little bit further down. Yeah. So this absence of Black women in the jungle genre functions on several terrains. Concealing or diminishing the existence of Black women serves as a suppression of an unacceptable sexual history for both slavery and colonialism, as a complementing fragment to the substitution of the Black male rapist for the white male rapist, as a negation of the suggestion of Black African family, or that Africa might serve as anyone's home, and as a species blank which allowed for the identification of Black men with apes. Woman is white female, thus she is natural. This is the natural object desire for an indeterminate variety of sexual males. Berenstein's psychodrama unfortunately fails to disconnect the intentions and compulsions of the filmmakers from their audience. And actually, I'll stop there because the rest part is great too. But this is interesting because it overlaps with some other reading that I've done on the creation of a history, and how you do it is when you negate certain natural things that we know, like mothers, fathers, women, men, from the kind of historiography. You then create this kind of way that you're able to situate a certain person. So like he says, like, if you take out the Black woman, right, the savage relationship will always be with the white woman, and then the white male can never be a rapist because there's no Black women. There's no Black women there, right? But the Black man, because he's a savage, will always go to try to take it, and the white man will always have to defend, right? And there's always these ways that you scrub out parts, right? You don't, like he says in How to Read Donald Duck, like, you don't give Huey, Dewey, and Louie a mother, right? They always have an uncle. They always have a couple of uncles, right, who take them, right? They have no maternal energy, so they're like these kind of like runts who kind of exist, and they constantly have to be reined in by their older uncles and taught them. Scrooge being the one with money, he has to teach them how to do good capitalism and so forth and so on. So it's what Robinson is showing here, I think, is it's a practice that I think then becomes really solidified in things like comic books and fantasy, right? And popular, like, American fantasy. I'm not talking about like the Game of Thrones type stuff. They love lineage and shit like that. Actually, it's actually what it's built on, but more like the comics, like, we don't know who Captain America's mom is and things like that, right? They just kind of come out of nowhere. You never see those kind of things. They have brothers and sisters and all this shit, or they add and subtract these things and points. They're kind of people without history. That's why Captain America can be the same guy for 60, 70 years. You know, he's been the same age for like 70 years. And then they age him in the last movie. It makes no fucking sense. Like suddenly he's aged, right? So it's interesting. But yeah, that's what I wanted to say. I mean, I think that's a great section. But there's more to say on the role of white women in this stuff.
Yeah, for sure. I just want to pull up one more slight aspect of that quote just because it's funny stuff again. So he says,
Oh, yeah.
and given the evidence, the films themselves, it is much more certain that the sexual and racial fantasies haunted the scriptwriters, directors, and producers of the jungle films and other genres. It is more difficult to infer what audience made of the constant recitation of this social instruction and titillation. Clearly, however, the absence of older white women in the genre, effectively negating their abduction by guerrillas or savages, can be taken as an indicator that filmmakers thought they were targeting an audience which shared their adolescent sexual desires and anxieties and racial conceits. So again, I always appreciate Robinson of like his like really nice ways of like telling people that they're perverts and stuff.
Yeah, but also pointing out that like these things are largely made by the people who make it and the critics. Like the idea that there was audience demand for it. No, people are working in capitalism and they're just going to whatever movie is there. They probably go, oh, this shit, it was weird, but like, you know, it was the movie that was available to me, especially like at that time where there is no market, there is no Netflix to scroll through, right? This is like the only movie in town. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see.
All right. So where do you want to jump ahead? I mean, so he talks about Tarzan here a little bit.
Yeah. What do I have written down? I mean, I think the only thing I really have is like up to, right around 318. I think I have something here. What did I write down?
There's here, I'll pull up one little section here. This is on Tarzan. He says his only black, in Tarzan, Planet of the Apes, Burroughs displayed no such sensitivity. So this is interesting. I mean, he always goes into the past of the writers and stuff like that. And Burroughs is complicated, has some stuff that's like, oh, maybe he was anti-racist here or whatever. Then he's like, his only black American character, Esmeralda, was directly drawn from minstrelsy. Expectedly pedestrian, Burroughs' introduction of Esmeralda was far from flattering. Quote, after these came a huge negress clothed like Solomon as to colors. Her great eyes rolled in evident terror, first toward the jungle, then toward the cursing band of sailors, end quote. As maid to Jane Porter, Jane, right? Jane's the object of Tarzan's, lust or whatever. Esmeralda was the mammy who served the dual purpose of ornamenting Jane's young white beauty and Jane's courage and level-headedness when skeletons were uncovered or a lion attacked. The only black among the group of castaways, Esmeralda was the least generous towards Africa, the least forgiving for the absence of modernity's amenities, and the least curious about the world of Africa. And of course, African savages were superstitious cannibals, right? So I brought this up because the cannibalism thing comes up quite a bit. It comes up also in Trader Horn, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a second. But also that he uses the one like black woman in the film to be like, to chastise Africans for their lack of civilization, basically. And it's like, hey, I want to get back to, the good old American South where we have nice things,
So one of the wild things, though, is that what I didn't know, I never read the Tarzan book, is, I mean, even the film is even like, it even further degrades it in many ways. So a couple of things, I'll read like little pieces, but I'll say, so one of the things is that it focused on the in the film, they charge the whole thing with like slaving to Arabs. Arab slave trade.
That's an interesting section. Yeah.
Right. And I found that fascinating. I mean, I don't really remember Tarzan, so I don't remember that, but like that was a fascinating thing. They decided to do that. He writes that constructing Arab slave trading as a major subtext of Tarzan of the Apes thus elided the slave histories of Britain and America and provided on an occasion to display Arabs as brutal. Several scenes depicted slave traders driving yoked African and European captives, and certainly undeserving of any post-war consideration. The film also considerably diminished Tarzan's hereditary instincts. So this part is also interesting because I didn't know this also. In the novel, Tarzan had taught himself to read and write English fluently. In the film, he is taught a rudimentary mastery of English by Binns. That's what I remember the Tarzan that he didn't, because he went to the savage area, quote unquote. He didn't know English and he got taught it, rather than like he had this like natural ability that they have in the book.
Yeah, so he's British aristocracy in the
Right.
in the British version of it, and then in Americans they make him kind of like
Yeah. But isn't he still a rich kid in a lot of the American stuff? I can't remember.
I think
I
so,
feel
but I
like he
think it
is
also I think it shifts in different
different times.
different films. Yeah.
Yeah. Um Yeah, I mean, like, there's so many changes. Like, yeah, in the novel, Jane and her party return to Baltimore, and Tarzan gives chase while undergoing a tutored transformation to a European gentleman. His first spoken language is French. The novel appropriates a Romeo and Juliet-like sequence of misapprehensions. Jane believes Tarzan is dead and does not realize that the half-naked white savage who rescued her is the same Tarzan who has written her of his love for her when they reunite in America. Tarzan, now aware of his lofty title, refuses to divulge his true inheritance, thus seemingly forfeiting Jane and his lands of his cousin Cecil. I gotta say, it's weird because it sounds like other films that I've watched, and it's really weird. In the film, following his rescue of Jane from the clutches of the leering black savage, the final scene is Tarzan and Jane embracing in a clearing just beyond the jungle.
Yeah.
Yeah, this last line is next line's really good. Though Tarzan and the Apes was a counterfeit of British colonialism, the casual racial meanness of the film seemed calculated to profit from the hatred broadly disseminated among white Americans.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is part of the point that he's making, is just like that there's a interesting interplay between these books and the film and what's going on with British colonialism versus what's going on in the United States. And yeah, I mean, actually, let's stop there just for a second, because I think this is an interesting point too. I mean, I made the joke obviously on the Instagram post about the famous tweet about how hard Phil Collins went on the Tarzan soundtrack. But they've done a lot of work over the years to like try to like soften the edges of a lot of this stuff. And so you see how these films, I mean, obviously they continue to get remade. We'll get to King Kong, which is obviously remade all the time. And but yet when you go back to the origins, like, you could see how incredibly racist they were. And so it's like there's also, I think, a very conscious, especially when it comes to like Disney, reshaping of things that they know, like this was problematic, like we need to redo it, and it's like, so then when you go to look for it, then you see the new version, right? And it's like, oh, we're not saying everybody's without history and savage and whatever. It's a cute white guy who goes in the jungle. So there's a very interesting thing, and yeah, I mean, I would say Phil Collins went so hard so that he could erase the colonial history of Tarzan.
He had to. He had a hard job to do.
He did that for us. Yeah.
That for us. Viva Phil. Anyway. Yeah, I don't have any more on this section. I don't know if you do. I mean, we could go now to the Trader Horn stuff, which is,
Yeah, I mean, I want to talk a little bit about Trader Horn. Yeah, he has more on Tarzan there. It's all interesting.
It's great. Yeah.
We can't go through all of it. So Trader Horn is this just very weird movie. And it actually predates Tarzan, I believe, because he one of the things he goes on to note is that the Tarzan movies are filmed on set in studios, and that Trader Horn is this interesting film because it's actually filmed in Africa. And it's really, I don't want to say the only, but it's like maybe the only major motion picture that's filmed in Africa in this period. And so then they just use stock footage that's from the movie for like the Tarzan movie to create these jungle scenes and stuff like that, you
It's
know.
hilarious.
And so yeah, this section is called Yelling at the Screaming Savages. I'm just gonna play like a quick clip, probably like a couple minutes.
Yeah, you have to.
Yeah, I do have to. It may get us demonetized, but I don't really care.
Aw.
I don't. Who gives a shit? Support the Patreon if you want to.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Hang on. All right.
White. She's beautiful.
Aye, and as great a savage as any of the black ones.
She's got to help us out of this. Horn, can't you make her understand?
We'll try, lad. Ranchero, Juana, tell her we're white like herself. Tell her we've come from her mother. Juana, tell her we've come to take her back to her people. Tell her she's got to get us out of this. I'm afraid it's no manner of use, lad.
C.C. McQuacken. Wait!
Don't touch her, lad!
Don't you understand? White people must help each other.
All right, that's enough of that.
Don't you understand? White people must help each other.
So no. So my understanding is that the way Robinson describes it, he's like they're speaking Swahili,
Mhm.
and she speaks it at a pace that's like so fast that it's like almost nonsensical. But so this is an interesting point of the film. So one of the things that's interesting about this film to Robinson in comparison to others is that these are actual African people in the film.
Mhm.
And there are some scenes like it's a very strange film, obviously. That's one of the stranger scenes, but it's it's fascinating. I mean, those two guys are these white colonists that are like one of them's a trader or whatever, and they're on a safari basically, and they run in. I'm gonna miss some points of the plot. You can watch it for yourself if you want to, if you are willing to subject yourself to that. But there's like a 30-40 minute scene where they're just like on a safari, and it'll just be like, oh wow, like there's an elephant, and then it'll be like a real picture of an elephant, and it'll be like, oh, like there's giraffes over there, oh, a lion, like, this kind of thing. And so that's all going on. It's like, follow these colonists through Africa, and the older guy, Trader Horn, is supposed to sort of be your guide of like, this is what life in Africa is like, and so on. And he actually, um how to put this, he's like, he likes Africa, I guess is what I would say, right? But as a colonist, right? Like he's like, this is our, it's for white people to kind of like conquer this space, etc. And he's showing the younger guy kind of the ropes, is basically what I would say. And in the scene before this, actually, I didn't want to show too much, but it's interesting because it's like this, it's a kind of classic scene that you might even think about in Return of the Jedi, when the
Mhm.
Ewoks, capture the Star Wars crew, and
Mhm.
C3PO is seen as the god to these people, right? And is able to like then convince them to let them go, basically. I don't remember if that's exactly how it goes, but it's sort of like the idea. Like in that, like she's C3PO, she's the god of this tribe in this story, goddess. And so there's a weird backstory to it as well, because there's a book, and in the book is written by a woman, and the woman, as Robinson describes her, is a liberal anti-imperialist and a feminist, is the way that he puts it. I love the phrase liberal anti-imperialist. That's funny to me. But she wrote this book that's basically about these four women who are kidnapped from Africa, and the idea is to like teach them about Western civilization and then bring them back to Africa to like make them bring people into civilization. And they're like, I'll try to find the section, but they all die like horribly, and it's like basically just, it's a real critique of Western civilization and all the things that, all the problems with it, and kind of why that's not a good idea. So it's very interesting and ironic that she also wrote the basis of this movie, in which the white woman, in her version, it's not a white woman, it's a woman who's a product of a white colonizer, and like a very light-skinned black person, basically. um so anyway, yeah, that's some context of what you all just saw. But
Mhm.
basically the rest of the plot is that they sort of convince her to go with them, and then they try to civilize her, right? Of course. And like that's the kind of the plot of it. But yeah,
But this is,
reactions,
yeah,
thoughts.
this is the ornament. It really is. It's like, because like think about how often this plot is resurrected in various ways, right? Someone of natural, you know, they have some kind of natural connection to whether it's whiteness or a kingship, right? They don't know it because of something that happened, whether it's an accident, whether they were orphaned or someone died, and so forth and so on. So these people must come in and rescue them from like the degraded savagery that they live in under. Right. Then they try to resurrect it a little bit in the 80s, where like, maybe some of that savagery is a little good, like the aristocrats a little too stuffy. What's that movie where John Goodman discovers he's like one of the heirs to the British crown, and everyone has died.
Oh,
King Ralph, I think it's called.
King Ralph. That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I
that's
forgot about that movie.
So then that's kind of a resurrection of that, right? Where like he goes there, he's super like unscrupulous, drinks beer, listens to rock and roll and the blues and soul music. But he gets to make Buckingham Palace rock a little bit. Some of the savagery is good, but he also has to learn, his really dignified, British side to him. His royalty. I mean, it's such a constantly resurrected plot line that always goes back to this bottom line that there is this prehistory savagery that come out of various parts of the world, and to be great, you have to shed it or you have to refine it in some kind of way. It's, yeah.
And interestingly, the book is written by this woman, Esmeralda Lewis is her name. And she, through interviews that she supposedly did, this is Robinson is very skeptical of this whole like backstory with this guy, Trader Horn, who was a real, settler, basically.
Some Carlos Castaneda stuff.
Right. Let me show this this real quick too. So this is the book about the 4 women. So it says the various fates of these women function as metonymies. I don't even know what that means, of other colonized women's lives under imperialism. This again is talking about a different book, but it's where Robinson's talking about this woman's politics. So at the Santa Maria's first putative trading stop on Africa's shore, the deer-like young Aziz is abandoned, diseased. After repeated rapes by the crew, she dies of shock at the sight of an ape shambling lustfully to the painful embrace that had destroyed a maiden child. Sappy, now an alcoholic and impregnated by the governor, drowns after falling from the deck. A quote, dark figure lost in the fever of primitive obscenities, end quote. In her drunken frenzy, she is pursued by the inflamed crew. Iragachu, under the merchant's surveillance, has been made an unwilling prostitute, her body commodified and diseased. Her landing on the coast offers primitive closure. She is seen as a goddess by the Bushmen, who offer her to their Gulliver, a castaway because of his leprosied hand. But the race they are destined to perpetuate will surely suffer from leprosy and venereal disease. Only Regunda, the mother desired by the impotent brother Secundus and subsequently by the governor, remained unviolated, but she commits suicide bereft of her friends, her son, and her home. So anyways, he said, thus then was the unadulterated Lewis, this is the author of the basis of this movie you all just saw a clip from, boldly parading her revelation on the predator sexuality with which imperialism licensed white males. In Trader Horn, Lewis had successfully submerged her feminist identity under the putative authorship of Alfred Horn and disguised her liberal anti-imperialism by proposing adventure in the boastful arrogance of Horn's accounts and the exploitative trade with natives and gentile Africa. So I just wanted to give some context of that. Part of why I think Robinson's also doing all of this too is something that he's talked about all through this book, which is that like people get conscripted, or they see benefit in doing different things to like actually get, a hit or whatever. And so it's like, here's this person who he actually thinks her politics are more solid than what comes out in terms of this film, which obviously is horrendous, like politically and racially and so on. I don't know what she said about that. I don't think he says that at any point. But he likes to complicate this, like, it's just the capitalists strictly imposing their narrative to say, like, a lot of times, I mean, this goes back to his work on the abolitionists in the early chapters and how a lot of their stuff ended up being then the tropes that show up in like minstrelsy, white folks in blackface minstrelsy. And so again, it's kind of that, I think, cautionary tale too that Robinson's doing a little bit of like, don't think you can just, subvert this thing or you can insert your politics into it. like by the time it becomes a major motion picture, it's going to be barbaric, the film, not the, so.
Yeah, I mean, he digs really deeply into this. I mean, I don't know if you have any more you want to say. I mean, it's a really good, his analysis of Trader Horn, and then of Tarzan, because he goes back to Tarzan too, in a good way. I mean, a lot of what he talks about is like how they design making Africa seem like a place without history. So like none of them of like cooking, doing actual things in life, right? While he does say what Trader Horn, I mean, and Jared, you already said this, but what made it kind of interesting was that it did have real Africans, right? It did have language. It had a kind of an authenticity, which the ones didn't have before. But with that authenticity, they were constantly obfuscated, right? So like everything is obfuscated and it's made into this way that nothing they can kind of shape it any way they want and really use what's powerful about film as a propaganda tool. They can edit and piece together through montage any way they want and then kind of reframe Africa as this place with dodgy customs, if they have customs at all, or if they're customs that are aggressive, degrading, and if a white person gets left there, they will default.
So this is one of the interesting things too, because Robinson does talk a little bit. One of the things I won't go to the actual passages, but what he talks about too is like how, I mean, there are scenes of what he thinks are authentic village life, essentially. And then like what kind of shifts that is what they call juju. This is what the colonizer, and so when they start playing their drums, basically like they turn into like cannibals or monsters, right? And so that scene also, I forgot to say this, where they're like basically about to become burned at the stake on like inverted crosses and all of this stuff. I mean, it's a very like, it's really shifting the kind of like lynch mob idea and putting it on its head, and I think that's a lot of the purpose too. Robinson does talk about that a little bit, but just of how in this era, you still have, of course, I mean, it's, it doesn't go away, but you still have a lot of racialized violence, and it shifts it and is like, like this is what Black people are like. If you just sort of leave them to their own devices, like they will do this to you, kind of thing, and like they may be okay, but once the like superstitions and the juju kicks in and the, then all bets are off. And they literally do have places in the film where they talk about cannibalism and stuff like that too, which, as somebody said, and Robinson has written about this as well. Europeans calling African cannibals while actively practicing cannibalism, an accusation is an admittance or something. And, this is something that Robinson makes the point of in Black Marxism, is that, during the so-called Dark Ages, that there were meat markets that served human flesh in Europe, basically.
I mean, that goes back to that idea where he talks about if you change the things, these things can't happen. So if you take out the Black woman, there can't be a white rapist, right? If you take out certain things, there can't be a white cannibal, right? It doesn't exist for them. So it's trying to trade, no pun intended, the practices that are common in one and put and imbue it into another.
So this is one other just quick thing I wanted to point to. I think you kind of referenced it, but I thought it was a good paragraph. It says, behind the opening credits, so this is as the film opens, there's an untenanted map of Africa assured those who had read the book that the film setting was West Africa, which is also fascinating, since the topography, fauna, cultures, and people portrayed in the film were not West African. Horn identifies Kikuyu and Maasai Kenyan nations. One takes this as an early signal of the filmmaker's indifference to African realities. But even more important was an explicitly racist conceit. The vast vacant expanse of the film's map recalled those pre-medieval and medieval representations of terra incognita, which is, a land without a people, basically, which documented a truer ignorance of the continent. But in the 1930s, representing Africa in this fashion was more likely the consequence of a more deliberate denial of African histories. The disappearance of civilizations, nations, cities, towns, villages was calculated. The map informed its audience that Africans had no past, which the West was obliged to acknowledge. So, yeah, that you've made that point, and he's talked about it elsewhere. But yeah, so I will say it's obviously there's like unintentional comedy, like we just showed, in like how ridiculous it is. And there's parts of it that are like exceptionally boring, but there's also it is a very interesting film, and it was also an extremely expensive film. He talks about that at some point later, but it's like 1.3 million or something like that, which is just a huge number back then. Way more expensive than like the Tarzan movies and stuff like that were. And also they went to Africa and did all of this shooting in Africa, and then they came back and they didn't have a movie. And he makes that point as well, that like what actually comes about is like them taking that footage and then creating certain things on set that would fit within it, which you can probably gather that scene that we just watched is like an example of like what they would add in to like create a movie of it. So I think he's also saying that to say the studio had a lot to do with like the final product, as opposed to, just maybe a director's and writer's vision of what it was initially.
So should we jump to King Kong at the end here of this part?
Yeah, let's talk about King Kong.
So he does. So, he talks about Tarzan, Trader Horn, and he does this interesting thing where he connects the plantation genre, the jungle film, all of them to King Kong. So it's a page 343. This section, I'll read this part. RKO's King Kong 1933 was the discursive bridge between the jungle film and its influential complements, the plantation genre, and minstrelsy. The tale of a monstrous gorilla forcibly transferred from its native domain to America might appear too literal a displacement of the African slave trade to work as fantasy. But the detailed reenactment of African slavery, the kidnapping, transfer, and commodification of African labor became romantic fare because of the manipulation of the white goddess myth and special effects. Kong and his prehistoric companions were activated through stop-motion animation, a technique perfected by Willis O'Brien for his creation, a scientific vision of life on Earth before anthropoids, but the originator and director of the project was Marion C. Cooper. I believe that it's right that black, brown, and yellow men should be dominated by the white. Oof. Now, the same tedious, painstaking process was employed to portray a fabulous counter-science, the naturalization of race. Yet the most revealing stratagem of the filmmakers was their treatment of the white goddess on screen, the exhibitionists of the goddess figure exposed in filming, within the film, the manufacturing of a rather ordinary white female into a white goddess. Like that of her immediate predecessor, Edwina Booth, Fay Ray's body becomes a double lure for Kong and moviegoers. In the film, Kong develops a totally unrealistic and, of course, unnatural sexual attraction for Ray. She is small enough to fit in his palm. This marks him as the bad nigger. Consequently, once he is transferred to America, his desires frustrate any effort to domesticate him, and he is killed. I mean, or you had that next section highlighted. You could totally read.
Well,
that
why don't
too.
we talk about the section you just read?
Yeah,
I do want to read the thing on RKO, but yeah.
I mean, look, I think this was a fascinating kind of culmination to, I think, really, because even the previous chapters, we talked heavily about minstrelsy, bringing in the plantation genre, and that King Kong, because I think we've been talking a lot about displacement, where like they, as the time goes on, they can't maybe be so on the nose, so they constantly have to keep like displacing through metaphor, right? So King Kong becomes this metaphor that they can take from many different pieces that they've been working with, remold it, it's still familiar enough, but there's enough plausible deniability within it. Well, I mean, it's really about an ape, man. It's not really about Africans. It's about an ape.
Yeah, it's like Curious George. Like people will
Yeah.
say, Curious George is not about, colonization. It's like the hell it's not.
Yeah. I mean, think about it now. Like, I mean, they just had another King Kong Godzilla movie like a couple of years ago. It's that they still use King Kong actively, right? So there's a way that they think that if we take off all these other pieces, it can be its own thing. But no, it literally, its origin comes from these very racist genres, and with an effort, I think, to make what he calls it the naturalization of race, the idea that these people from this world, they'll come here, they'll have unrealistic attractions, right? Which I think is also a big theme, about the animosity towards race mixing. He talks about a lot in the book, right? And particularly through black man and white woman, right? And then I like that dig. He says a rather ordinary white woman. She's not even out there looking like banging. She's just like a regular old white lady. And yeah, I mean, and then when he's transferred to America, his desires frustrate any effort to domesticate him, and he is killed, right? So when he comes here, because he's unrealistic, he becomes this frustrated thing. So then black frustration is this unrealistic reaction because blackness has no rationality, right? So we got to kill him, So when the Black Panthers come in the 60s, they're just being irrational. When the BLA is out here saying, Republic of New Africa, they're just being irrational. We got to stomp these people down. And that's why they said like Nat Turner was 8 feet tall, right? He's King Kong, right? All this stuff. It's part of the narrative. It's this black anger is this irrational lust, and you got to put it down once you see it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this is a good comment. Did we talk about The Lion King? I thought about The Lion King quite a bit as I was reading this section. And mainly through the lens of like it's this movie, especially I don't think I've even watched the remake, the
Barry Jenkins remake.
Yeah, I have not watched that.
I just think that he did that. It's hilarious. But anyway, go.
But the the 93 animated film or whatever it is, I think that it's a new version where what you see is an Africa without people, essentially, right? And we could even think of like, what's that other one? There's another animated movie I'm thinking about that's not Disney. It's anyway.
I didn't think about that. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think that's part of what's happening, is that it's like it's still reminding us of sort of the lack of history, of civilization of these parts of the world, that like we can just do a movie about animals in this space, and again, like it connects with Robinson's discussion of like Africans, if they're there, like they're just part of the fauna, like they're just wild animals basically in this view of the world. Right. They have to be domesticated, again, to think about all the ways that Orasami Burton talks about that word too. Yeah. So I'm not trying to tell people what to not watch with their kids. Yeah. So Madagascar, that's what I was thinking of. Madagascar. And there's what's the one? There's the king in it that's a lemur that has like a series that's actually a hilarious series that they had a number of seasons for. But again, like his whole depiction is like this African dictator, basically, right? Or king, right? Who's constantly misleading his people and, comes up with all these schemes sort of to rule them. And my kid used to love it, but like that's under the surface. That's what's going on, I think. Yeah. Anyway. All right. So I do want to say this piece. So the RKO Pictures thing is interesting. I don't know all the history of RKO Pictures, but it also does have an association with Disney, maybe on a distribution level early on, because like Song of the South was created by Disney but distributed by RKO. But anyways, this is a great passage again from Robinson. You know, RKO's Radio Pictures was the most naked outpost in financial capital's colonization of the movie industry. Hobbled together in 1927-1928, RKO remained a creature of the bankers, investors, manufacturers, and media moguls who ruled over General Electric, Westinghouse, RCA, NBC, Macaroni Wireless, and Telegraph, and so on. Considering its pedigree, not unexpectedly, RKO produced more than its share of the worst pictures released during the early years of the Depression. But given its ready access to capital, it might be surmised that the studio possessed a degree of immunity from its profit losses and even most dire fallout to bankruptcy. With the extraordinary political latitude afforded the studio, its films could range from treatments of the movie industry's corrupt and sexist practices to scathing critiques of arrogant renegades like William Randolph Hearst, which is Citizen Kane. So yeah, and he talks about them to kind of pivot because I think they were involved. I think he said in King Kong. Yeah, he does say that. But also to Amos and Andy, which again is like one of these kind of bridges of like black minstrelsy into like mainstream. It's kind of similar to, you know, Step and Fetch It or what's other, you know, I mean, we'll talk about Mantan in a little bit, but yeah. So anyways, it's just an interesting point that he's making there. But I thought the piece about just, again, him talking about the capitalist interests involved is always really interesting.
Yeah. So the next section he calls Putative Alternatives, which I think is a great title. Because it does begin to answer some of my questions. Because, like, you know, I said in the book he did use the word resistance, and I talked to Jared about this offline. I think I might have even said it. I've been curious, like, how he saw resistance in this, and it's become clear to me that, like, what he's talking about is a kind of resistance that I think he probably ultimately sees as futile. He's not as like super hammering on it. I think on some cases maybe he's trying to be empathetic, maybe toward like Moreland or someone like that, or some of the others that we've covered in the book earlier. But definitely not for, I think, for the white folks, like people like O'Neill or anything. He might be understanding or reasons with their psychology, but he'll never be, you know, soft on them. Anyway, so he brings in a piece, The Emperor Jones, which is a Eugene O'Neill play, which is well known in many, infamously, famously. I don't know how it is dealt with these days. I know when I was when it was around in the 90s, when I was still acting in theater, it was going through a weird resurrection. They had did it. I think the Wooster Group had did it. I know they did The Hairy Ape, which is another one of his plays, O'Neill's plays, that are considered to be a bit funky. What's his name was in it? Willem Dafoe was in it. And it definitely garnered some, you know, attention, both positive and negative. So he brings up The Emperor Jones, and he says at the very top, like, Paul Robeson's performance in Emperor Jones in 1933 provided an almost seamless complement to King Kong. So, like, he doesn't even like give you the, like, is Emperor Jones, you know, possibly, you know, an alternative? Nope. I'm gonna let y'all know straight out. It's a compliment, right, to it, right? He says Robeson brought a physical graphicness to the railroad porter, Brutus Jones, authenticating Eugene O'Neill's portrait of a black sociopath indifferent to his community and his race. So yeah, the film is an adaptation of the play. What the film does, actually, that I've known this for a long time, is that the play almost fully takes place that when Brutus Jones goes to the island and tries to become the emperor. The film actually adds all the Pullman Porter stuff at the beginning. I actually had, because I've read the play and I've seen it. So the film actually adds this stuff. So some of the interesting things that I found out historically about O'Neill on this was that Haiti was actually an inspiration for the plot. O'Neill claimed that the political elements of the second half of the film were based on the account of the rule of Guillaume Sam, president of Haiti from February to July 15th, while the character of Brutus was a composite of two blacks he had encountered during his travels. One a powerfully built bartender in Deacon, the other a colorful Negro, Joe Smith, one of whose sayings, "Day some tings ain't got to be told. I can see them in folks' eyes," appears and intact in the play, right? O'Neill's fantastic reconstruction of the short, nasty rule of President Sam bore only a superficial resemblance to reality. I like that he's using fantastic in its derogatory form, right? It's fantastical, not fantastic great. The peasant-based rebellions, which shortened the administration of several Haitian presidents in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, were largely precipitated by factors originating outside Haitian society. Haiti's social turmoil resulted from a foreign-dominated economy organized to impoverish most of its 1.5 million citizens. So once again, Robinson is situating on like the forgery, right? And that O'Neill is going off of a forgery of Haiti to kind of get his inspiration of the play. And then later the film, and he talks about more about it. He has some stuff from James Weldon Johnson, talking about the occupation and invasion of it with like the banking interest, which is really interesting. I won't read that, but it's good. It's really, really good stuff. I kind of want to get to the piece a little bit because where is I read that part. Yeah, actually I kind of want to get to 347. Before I get there, one of the things about Emperor Jones is, so the people who know the plot, is he's this porter. He gets into an issue with legal troubles, so forth and so on, and he ends up having to go to this island of black people, and he ends up becoming their ruler. But he becomes so drunk with power, he has this like really like psychological break, and basically he's a completely unsuccessful ruler, right? And like and a savage, right? A complete savage. So I want to read this part on 347 because I think Robinson does a great piece of writing here. Brutus Jones, which seems closer to the exotic primitive stereotype which Sterling Brown attributed to non-black writers who scoured the dives of Harlem in search for the Negro au naturel. The figure who emerges from their pages is a Negro synchronized to a savage rhythm, living a life of ecstasy, superinduced by jazz, repetition of the tom-tom, awakening vestigial memories of Africa, and gin, that lifted him over antebellum slavery and contemporary economic slavery and placed him in the comforting fastness of the motherland. The import of Emperor Jones was to confirm that black sovereignty was doomed and chimerical. From his black cultural nationalist perspective, the playwright Lofton Mitchell issued a caustic judgment of the play. O'Neill implicitly suggests there is really no need to look toward the freeing of black people because once freed, they will do the same thing as whites. Thus, in the 5th year of the occupation, when the NAACP was finally launching its long campaign of opposition to American rule in Haiti, the play provided one more reiteration of the official American position that only white people could bring order to that society. And in 1933, in concert with the imagery of King Kong, the release of Emperor Jones as a film might be seen as substantiating the message while reserving the plot trajectory. Neither Kong nor Jones could come to terms with civilization. Their dysfunction was not a consequence of where they were, but what they were. I mean, that's a great, really, to me, amazing paragraph. Because I remember when someone gave me the play, I think I was in college, and it was a white professor of mine who was pretty clueless. And I read it, and that's actually the message that I got. I was like, is this just saying that, like, am I supposed to take some kind of existentialist thing that no one can rule, even black people, and things like that? But no. And I was like my generous read of the piece, but then like my real read was like, no, you think y'all could do it, but this uneducated black man, with too much ambition, he'll potentially lose his shit. So yeah, I mean, so he goes into stuff with the Pullman porters also, and I think this goes back to what Robinson is doing. He does a really interesting thing of like the relationship of the Pullman porters with what was going on with labor had somewhat of an interest in how the film would end up being presented, things that they would tone down with the film and so forth and so on. So it became this kind of like political issue. And he does really good stuff on that. I'm not going to go through that. I don't know if you had anything on that. But it's, I mean, it shows what's really good about the book is that what Robinson does is he'll always take the film or the piece and then he'll add these like tentacles to the actual political realities to suggest that, I mean, any film that comes out, we have to think about the political reality that comes with it, right? I mean, I think of like when Dead Man Walking won the Oscar years, or Susan Sarandon won the Oscar for Dead Man Walking, and it became this big kind of thing because liberals at that time were really into the death penalty, right? So it needed that kind of Oscar push, and these ways that they kind of play into these things and the kind of political reality of a moment that can kind of push a film somewhere or get it made, or also get it totally tanked if it like is doing something and like for some reason is criticizing this one thing. We have to tank this movie because it's not going to work for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking ahead. Like he goes into. Do you have anything else on this film? He goes into the imitation of life.
Yeah, I don't really have anything on that. There's another section of it that I'm a little sad that like I didn't read. He talks about an actress. Remember her name?
Washington, is that what you're talking about?
Washington, yeah, who was definitely suppressed because of her politics. Right?
Yeah,
isn't that the one?
she's in Imitation of Life.
Yeah. Which I didn't do enough scanning of, which I regret not going through it as diligently.
Yeah, so she gets essentially blackballed from the industry. It's interesting. I did find it interesting on this that he doesn't, that I can recall, really talk about Robeson at all as a political figure. And I think it's maybe the timing, because I think that becomes more of a thing in like the World War II and
when does he go to the
McCarthyism
Soviet
and all that.
Union? When did he go to the Soviet Union, Robeson? 34. He first visited in 34.
So he should have brought that up.
Yeah, I thought. Yeah, I was surprised by that too. Or I'm curious because if Robeson did Emperor Jones in 34, he did the Micheaux film in the 20s. Which one of the Body and Soul? When did he do that? Body and Soul, 25. Yeah, that's interesting. I'm curious. That is curious too that he didn't dig further into him.
So I'll read this well, it's not so little, but I'll read a passage about Washington just to give folks context of who she was. So she's a figure in Imitation of Life, an actress who plays a figure in Imitation of Life, which is another movie that he's critical of, by the way. But it says Washington consistently challenged Black performers who projected Blacks as rural idiots or urban C-words. And in her July 31st, 1943 column, Washington had taken umbrage at elements in the stage performance of the Black comedian Tim Moore. A constant theme of her column was those entertainers who employed what she interpreted as the dated routines of Black minstrelsy and blackface minstrelsy. This time, she criticized Moore for comedic bits which abased what Washington usually referred to as the quote-unquote new Negro, and for, quote, razor-wielding, women debasing, unquote, humor. Washington published a portion of Moore's letter to her in which he referred to Piola, quote, "I have never seen you on the stage but once, and that was singing the blues, and I think they had a little dice shooting and murder. I did not see anything uplifting to the race in the part you played. I also did not see anything uplifting about the part of a colored woman you played in Imitation of Life,
Wow.
who was ashamed of her own mother because she was dark," end quote. Washington's retort is instructive. This is the part I really wanted to get to. She said, "I should like to point out to Tim that I do not take exception to the criticism of parts I've done in the theater and on the screen which date back 10 years or more. But I should like to clarify for Tim and others who are confused on the issue. The fact is that 10 years ago, we were a slumbering people standing still with no particular knowledge of the plight of our unfortunate brothers in far off lands or at home for that matter. It is hardly necessary to try to point out the terrific worldwide changes which have taken place since that time. Unprecedented attention has been given to the Negro since the war began because of the fact that we are theoretically free, but actually part slave under a vicious system. These and many more reasons, which certainly must be acquainted with, are why what was considered all right in the theater or on the screen 10 years ago are not at all right now. Today, we are shedding blood for democracy," end quote. And so, again, like Robinson uses this and he talks quite a bit. Interestingly, too, another passage I won't go into detail on, but he does talk a lot about World War One and how Black folks in the United States are conscripted into World War One, but also how all of the European colonizing powers also conscripted their African subjects in World War One, which actually is interesting because that's a story I'm very much familiar with World War Two. I am familiar with Black folks coming back from World War One and being trained as soldiers and like the race riots and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But he goes into a lot more detail on it, and he has this great line too that maybe I'll find it, but is basically along the lines of, that the war told the lie of colonialism because what folks were told was that civilized nations didn't war with each other, and they were instead put in, forced, and he talks about often quite brutally and against their will into being conscripted into these European armies, and saw, millions of people being like industrial scale slaughtered for these imperialist nations in Europe. And so anyways, he's just using all of that, but he appreciates, Washington as a figure who, gets taken out of Hollywood, but also is self-critical about her own representations, even as she's critical of what others are doing that are still in the industry.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I mean, there's a bunch in between it. But this to me seems like an interesting kind of contrast to what kind of becomes his final button of the book, really, of the section and then of the book, where he steps back into Mantan Moorland and thinking about him. And there's this section on 373 that I want to read. It's a long one, but I think it's worth reading because, and it's funny because even to get to the end of it, you're gonna have to scroll past. You'll start and you'll notice you have to scroll past two of his big posters. It'll be interesting to see. It'll kind of work. So I'll read this part. Mantan Moorland was a brilliant creator of inversion, angling his approach to the textual inventory of film plots in order to suggest alternative realities. Cast in a series of program mysteries in the 1940s, including several Charlie Chan pictures, Moorland consistently constructed a comedic space which paralleled, ornamented, and on occasion threatened the principal plot of the films in which he appeared. Moorland's characters always spoke in the Black dialect of minstrelsy, the imagined language of the plantation slave and the coon. This caricature constituted a contract between Moorland and the studios and between Moorland and his non-Black audiences. Costumed as a jester, Moorland resembled a trifling irrelevancy, and he appropriated for his own purposes this insistent inference of an other American, a primitive, inferior, and nearly unintelligible Black American. He imploded this alien, implying a backstory of an alternative existence into a fully realized social location and cultural field. He performed his characters as if they were presumptuous anthropologists inserted into the mundane machinations of murders and intrigues, and intrigue which enveloped his white counterparts. Entirely fluent and familiar with the cultural practices of this white society, Moreland, it was a rare performance when his characters displaced him, observed and continuously verbalized his field notes. And in his habit of overtly expressing displeasure, irony, and amusement, he seemed to be fully confident that his mask of ignorance, coupled with his assigned social inferiority, would shield him. Moreland conspired with, or on occasion induced, a form of racial solipsism. He appeared to concede the premise that only the relationships of the white actors are real, meaningful, or relevant to the film's central plot, and camouflage with the most extreme trappings of the black-faced minstrel. So let me go past these these images. We probably can go back to them. Minstrelsy, feet don't fail me now. Moreland achieved a documented record of black coding of filmic reality. So he goes back to Moreland, and I think in a really interesting way, because he does a thing where he explains, I think, his technique, and he recognizes the techniques like prowess. He makes him a thinking person. He doesn't make Mantan Moreland this kind of individual that is the buffoon that people would think he is to be, right? He wasn't a buffoon. He was a very intelligent individual who was doing a particular approach to these cards he was dealt. But what Robinson, I believe, rightly says is this was a flawed activity, right? It's a form of racial solipsism, right? It is him kind of being singular. He's kind of singularing himself, right? It's his own thing, and he says pretty much like he's still centralized to the imperialist project, right? No matter what he wanted to do, even if it's for his own individual, I guess, gain or individual spotlight of the things he could do, it didn't really subvert that much, right? Or its subversions don't upend the project, right? And I think that's a really great way to kind of situate him, because I feel like with someone like Moreland, there is the way to either all or nothing him, where you kind of go, he was just a dummy who was being a coon, right? Or nah, man, he's brilliant. He subverted the whole thing. No, it's you really have to think about the project in a very, 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 very materialist way, and think about he's doing what he was trying to do. We get it, but it wasn't successful. And I think what you showed from Washington, that to me it puts up how powerful she was, because her statement is basically what? Like, look at this, man. This ain't a landscape where anything real is going to happen. You know what I'm saying? There's nothing real going to happen here. I could do all of this and all of that. It's not going to happen, And yeah, so I really was into that section, and it satisfied a kind of curiosity for me about the book and where the book was going, because I wasn't exactly sure. I didn't think he would ever resurrect it, but I was curious, not resurrected, respect it, but I didn't know exactly to what level he would go into a criticism of it.
Yeah, and I think, again, like, this is a line later on, but he says Moreland's intervention was circumstantial. There was the war, certainly, but also the fact that Monogram Pictures was a small studio accustomed to working the product gaps, lapses, or remainders of the major studios. So he's also saying, like, it comes about in a specific space where people aren't really watching what's going on as closely. And I think circumstantial, I mean, he's saying it I think what he's saying is that, you know, the war is going on and they're paying more attention to that. Also, but yeah, and he goes on to Charlie Chan a little bit more, which maybe you want to say a
Yeah,
little
I
bit
mean, he
about.
has
Yeah.
this really, like, I think it's a nice little button on 378 where he goes into Charlie Chan, and he talks about it because Moreland ended up being in these Charlie Chan films, which I slightly remember. I've seen a few of them. Yeah, and it's interesting to see how they're situated. But there's this line. So yeah, one of its staples was the mystery genre, like the Charlie Chan series. The series simultaneously dignified and parodied Chinese. Coolie characters were rare in the series, and the younger generation of Chan's children were enrolled at UCLA, spoke standard English, sprinkled with jive phrases, and effortlessly mingled with whites. In short, Charlie Chan was not a white accessory. His very appearance in a case signaled white failure and was often an explicit surrender of white conceits. And early in almost all of the films, the villains marked themselves by their inability to recognize that Chan's professional identity as a detective was more threatening to them than his racial identity. On the other hand, the old man spoke pidgin, seasoned with faux Confucianisms, and no Asian actor was cast as Charlie Chan. And once Moreland joined the series as Birmingham Brown, that name, Charlie's household was diverse, lively, daring, and comic. Just as Charlie policed the messier boundaries of American society, Monogram habituated a space between the rigid racial conventions of the big studios and an audience largely working class and with affection for mysteries, horror films, thrillers, and low comedies. So what I find fascinating about this, and I think is really interesting, is there's a way that Charlie Chan exists still, because what it is playing is this person who is that the outsider has wisdom, but it's almost like a folk wisdom, right? It's not a first world wisdom, you want to call it, or it's some kind of strange amalgamation of like these old things, and he's plopped into this new society, and where the new society, civil society, will be able to kind of admit that, yeah, we do these things, but these are these little things we can't see, so we need a kind of like slightly elevated primitive to kind of go in and do it. But then like the weird kind of psychological break was they would never let an actual Asian play Charlie Chan do it, and then also I don't know if Asians actually even wanted to do it, but they would get all these white people to kind of play, you know, Charlie Chan. So it also becomes this kind of acknowledgement that also Charlie Chan isn't real. So you're also acknowledging that like Asians can't be that smart, right? It's like these like double, triple, quadruple levels of racism. That also, and it shows you how irrational racism is. Right? Like it doesn't, like you start trying to find the rational kernel and you can't. It's just irrational. It doesn't make any sense. Right? But that Charlie Chan type character, I mean, exists in ways. I mean, Mr. Miyagi has a Charlie Chan origin, I have to say. Like there is that kind of thing that exists with Mr. Miyagi and the various other characters that have this old folk wisdom. You come in there, you have the folk ability, right? And you help them. And then, but then there's always that moment where Mr. Miyagi's too primitive, right? So he needs Daniel to kind of keep him current, right? And things like that. I mean, it's so built on these racist depictions of old worlds or foreign worlds and so forth and so on.
I'm gonna have to go back and watch Short Circuit again.
Yeah,
I
I didn't know that.
forgot that.
I didn't know that till I was older. I did not know that,
Yeah.
and someone told me that. That screwed me up.
Yeah, because I loved those movies when I was a kid.
Oh
too.
man, I was obsessed with Short Circuit. I was obsessed with, and it's funny because the first one and the second one are very different too. The first one's very dark, and the second one's very like happy. Right, until it gets really sad and like, but yeah, they totally brown faced the guy. Someone told me that. I mean, there's a lot of those. I mean,
absolutely.
Delta
And you
Force.
go in-
Robert Forster is a I don't know if they named the country, the Arab nation that they are, but got white Robert Forster browned up playing a terrorist. It's
Yeah,
terrible.
no, that was very common even into like the 80s, really.
Yeah.
Like it became less common, I think, in the 90s. But like, I still remember, like, if you watch a lot of films from 60s, 70s, 80s, like you'll see white folks playing indigenous folks or Asian folks or Arabs or whatever,
Yeah.
Yeah, it's wild.
Homegirl from Aliens.
Yeah.
Who's Jewish, and she white Jewish lady. She's playing Vasquez. I didn't know that till I was a teenager. I was like, what? And I love that. I love that. I was all into that character, and I was like, oh damn.
Yeah, one point that he makes here, which is interesting. So, this is as he's closing out and he's talking about World War II, which is where he ends things. He ends with World War II and the end of World War II, basically. But, he talks about basically. So he cites Cripps here again, who he's talked about a lot throughout this book, but among other film historians, asserts that an industry which had ended the decade with Jezebel and Gone with the Wind was compelled by political and consequently commercial considerations to suspend its projection of white racism. Both the Office of War Information and the NAACP had put pressure on the moguls, it is true, but the results were inconsistent. Created in June 1942, the OWI found its Bureau of Motion Pictures Monitoring Agency, the Domestic Operations Branch, defunded by Congress in July 1943. Subsequently, the BMP resorted to threats against export licenses reviewed by its overseas branch. But even with its clear mandate to remove racist stereotypes and slurs from American motion pictures, the BMP analysts were often bemused by their own immersion in a racist culture. Evaluating the script for Monogram's Revenge of the Zombies, which again is one of the films that features Mantan Moreland, Lillian Bergquist observed, quote, "The Negroes are presented as a strange, uncivilized, and superstitious group of people in a world quite apart from that of other Americans. They are either comic servants, zombies, or in the case of Mammy Beulah, a voodooist. There is not one real Negro American in this story," end quote. And Beulah, that becomes a whole, I think it's probably associated. That becomes a whole radio thing in itself, that I think is probably associated to a racist Mammy radio show, basically, or whatever.
I don't know much about that.
Yeah. But anyway, he kind of closes, here in the next couple of pages, making some points and talking about some different things. I guess I'll read he does talk about a Hitchcock film, Lifeboat, which I haven't seen that one.
I've seen Lifeboat, but not recently. That's with Tallulah Bankhead, which is so interesting because that's who Clay calls Lula in Dutchman. He calls her Tallulah Bankhead, which is very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So he calls it a minor rupture. He says there's some interesting things that Hitchcock is doing there in that film around race. But he does say then, this is just how he closes. He said Hitchcock's film was a minor rupture, a momentary interrogation of the cultural thread which had been subsidized for centuries. Song of the South figuratively set aside such impostors. In a post-war world, the usable myths of whiteness would have to be restored. And so that's where he ends. Like, and Mtume and I both talked about this a little bit, but the book does end quite abruptly. Like, he doesn't give us any conclusion. He doesn't give us any even like really kind of summarizing closure to the last chapter, which is 100+ pages long.
Yeah.
I think this book is like one of those books too, where, like you could almost teach any chapter of it as like a full book in itself that you would read over multiple weeks if you were teaching it in a class. Like it's so deep. I mean, we just spent 3 hours and 15 minutes so far talking about this chapter,
and we missed out. We cut out stuff.
We left out some important things. Yeah, absolutely. And And obviously there's a lot of films that he's talking about too. So if you were doing it in a class, like I think you would want to show some of these films and be able to talk about what's going on with them. But yeah, I mean, I think my kind of we could talk about our takeaways a little bit.
Yeah.
One of mine at the end is just sort of like the reason that he ends it this way. I mean, he does talk about in a post-war world, the usable myths of whiteness would have to be restored. I mean, he's looking at this moment, he's looking at Mantan Moreland, and he's also talking about some of these spaces and some of the ways that the industry is trying to, tamp down racism with the war, because again, Black folks constitute a lot of soldiers. And he, this is these are some of the things, like he's always kind of doing a conjunctural analysis of racial regimes, right? They're really kind of there's a thinking of like, what are the big imperial projects that are going on? What are they trying to get us to, accept or, sign on to? And these things shift over time. And sometimes, white supremacy might be a little less convenient. And sometimes it's very convenient to the project, I think a lot about like, just the way that Arabs have been portrayed in the last like 30 years of films,
40 since the 80s.
TV. Yeah, since the 80s. I know. I forget that the 80s aren't 30 years ago anymore.
Yeah. I know. Sorry. I know why.
It's okay.
I get it. We're not that far from age. We're about the same. I get it.
1994 was how long ago?
How long ago exactly?
Yeah.
No,
go ahead. You keep going.
Yeah, no. Like I'm with you. Like, it was very abrupt, and I get it. It left me with like tons of questions because one of the things that you end up seeing, so you have the war period, and the war period is very particular. Like when we're in World War II and the films that are made, then we get out of the war, and he makes the suggestion that a new kind of thing needs to be done and resurrected. But then I wonder how he would situate the rise of Sidney Poitier then in the 50s, right? And other kind of Black people within the project, and the idea of like the new race films and these are not films to me that are like really sufficient. And Sidney to me is a very problematic figure in the movie world. And I think there's a way that reading this book, though you would have to do other kinds of scholarship and other kinds of studies and other kinds of points, but there is things in this book that can show you that the rise of Sidney Poitier would then eventually be inevitable. But then where I get really interested is like the 60s, when there is the need for rebellions that start to come about. So I'm curious how he would situate someone like Melvin Van Peebles when he did Watermelon Man, and then he had to go do Sweetback. Does he see that as a recognition? What Melvin did, does he see that as a recognition of that the Mantan thing doesn't work? It's funny thinking about Watermelon Man and Godfrey Chambers, who I loved, but Godfrey Chambers had made comments about that, kind of similar to Washington, that this thing is rigged, and no matter what I do here, this whole thing will always be a little bit. And then Watermelon Man becomes an interesting movie if you think about it, because at the end of Watermelon Man, he basically just becomes revolutionary. He's like in a class, learning how to fight, getting ready for the battle, which I think is amazing. But then also the Black Arts Movement. And then how does he situate that? Does he situate the Black Arts Movement as this ultimate recognition that this kind of relationship is untenable and it doesn't have the ability to work? It's just never going to sustain itself. So I guess I have questions. I'd be curious like how he saw it. I don't know we talked about it. Like, I'd be curious to see his other writings, if he wrote about those other things. But yeah, my overall impression of the book is I think it's extremely valuable because he's doing an analysis of the development of film that doesn't just look at it as some kind of idealistic or idealist actually way of, you know, we did it on our own creative whims and energies, and thus we have this great thing called film. No, it was part of a large imperial project, technological project that is attached to the state and attached to the government. I definitely have things that I would have loved to have seen, or I feel like there's complementary things that I would love to read. I'd be curious to know more about the intricacies of the wars between the different nations when it came to film. He touches on a lot of it. I think it's very interesting, so forth and so on, and like trying to, you know, make power through it. But yeah, I mean, there's much more I could say, but I do think it's a lot of you. I mean, this book is amazing. It's fun on many levels, and I agree with you. Like, I think I would like for this would be my go-to to show for Micheaux, and I would just pluck that out and then like have a thing on that. Or I mean, the earlier stuff with like Shakespeare and the origins of racialized thinking, which I think that'll upset a lot of people.
Oh, it does.
That one upsets, I think, people more than anyone. I think this idea that
yeah, it's the thing that people have the most issue with Robinson, and
Yeah.
I refuse to understand it.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, and look, even as someone who comes from like Marxist traditions, I haven't read Black Marxism, but like I said, what I read there does not have tension with that. That does not have tension to me. That makes sense. It actually makes it make more sense because what is the material that they were creating this racial regime from? They had to create it from something. It didn't come out of nowhere.
Yeah, right.
So like, I don't understand.
Yeah. I think there are, what I would say about Black Marxism, I probably said this on previous episodes, but there are there's some really great scholarship in Black Marxism. There's some really great writing in that book. There are aspects of it that the question is, do I disagree or do I think that his presentation of the material leads people to certain, like, he can be a little, I mean, I don't mind saying this, he can be a little bit polemical sometimes, and you could see that through reading this book.
Yeah, he can.
In like when he doesn't, there are passages he writes with no citations where he's just hitting you with stuff, and a lot of that is some of his best writing, but it's also it's like, this is my take right now, like, I'm giving you this, and he would do that. And there are times when he does that in Black Marxism where I'm just like, that's not my take, you know,
Right.
like, so, and I guess to be more specific, right? Well, I don't really want to, because it's just, I think it's a good book to be read. I think it's misread quite often.
Mhm.
I think there are things in it that can maybe leave open interpretations, or even you could say that Robinson maybe is proposing some of these things that give a little bit more of an essentialist view. And I don't want to go far down that road, because people get really upset when you start to say that about Robinson. And I think books like this are the reason why people get upset, because it's like, there's nothing about this book that would lead anybody to any of that kind of conclusion. But he'll do things that'll just sort of say, like, something is the essence of European culture or Western. And, as Arun Kunani, talks about, like, Robinson understands that Western culture is a forgery. So he doesn't think of it as, he's not saying, again, that these are innate things. And you could see all of his bristling in this text anytime somebody suggested that something was innate about the condition of Black people or Africans or whatever. And when he's talking about, people like Griffith or whatever, like, they're constitutionally disposed, or whatever, right? Like, I just think that, yeah, so I think one, Black Marxism is written, let me see if I can do the math right. I don't know if I can. 37 years later, roughly,
Oh wow.
almost 40 years later. So I think Robinson is just at his peak at this point of like how he's able and how much stuff he's read and just knows and is able to just, you know, whereas I think, Black Marxism is a very early book for him, and it's a product, I think, of the period and the people he's around and some of the things he's thinking. And I don't, you, you know, you say that and you sound like you're sort of denigrating the book. I still think it's a really good book,
Yeah.
but there are pieces of it in terms of conclusions or whatever that I think sometimes give people a misguided impression of Robinson too.
Mm-hmm.
Like people will read that and say he's a proto-Afro pessimist, or he's a black nationalist and things like that. And like I think those are misreads of that book as well. But I can sort of understand, people coming away with those opinions of that book. Whereas I think if you read this, you see a very, you get more clear on his analysis of things, I think.
Yeah. No, I mean, I actually plan on reading Black Marxism this summer, like because I feel like I would like to know and be able to kind of speak to it, and where I am, and also after reading this book, I felt reading more of his work is something that I would really like to do. Probably would need to reread the Terms of Order too, because I read that so long ago. I don't really remember it as much as I would like to, but. One thing I will say is, it's interesting, and I'm saying this without any kind of real skin in the game in terms of like the argument around the book. But one of the things that I do think that does happen is especially when people question Europeanism, like I had this back and forth with I don't want to call them reputable, a reputable white Marxist in a circle that I don't really care about. That's what I'll say. That I don't think really has that much energy. But the argument that I had with him was around Europeanism and Eurocentric thinking, and how that kind of surrounds a lot of white Marxist thinking. And I told him that I think it's fundamentally un-Marxist, actually, your approach, right? But then his argument back to me always is, oh, you're just a nationalist. So it becomes like a slur. You're not really a Marxist, Mtume. You're not really a scientific socialist. You're just a nationalist, really. You're really just what was it? I got nationalist. I even got black capitalist, which was wild. Yeah, like this is all black capitalism. You do realize that. And I was like, what the fuck are you talking about? So they grab these slurs. And like I said, I don't know the intricacies of the argument with Robinson, but I do get a bit curious when people look to not argue, we go with the argument and they go into these like large words. And I think it's something that, especially when you're dealing with Europeanism, because like my comment is something that I said, it's like these are like these white Marxists who also like liberalism, like the kind of like the Jacobin crowd who think that like, we need to fuse classical liberalism and Marxism as if they're not in tension with each other, which is insane to me. I actually just don't get the argument historically.
The CIA would agree with you.
Yeah. Right. And like, I don't want to like, and it's funny because I noticed like the white people that they hate, they don't like people like someone like Gabriel Rockhill. They actually don't like him for saying shit like that. They actually don't. Mm-hmm. They think he's betraying something. And I'm like, what? The fact that he's telling you that the CIA worked with some of these people who wanted to do that, so it's very weird. But yeah, I digress.
No, yeah. And I think that like to me, Robinson doesn't have to be a Marxist. Like I've never seen anywhere where he claimed that. He did claim to be a socialist, and I think he was. But I think for him, like he's critical of Marxism. We've talked about this enough probably throughout these episodes, but like here's the issue I think people take is that obviously Lenin critiqued Marx, or Mao critiqued Marx, in that they took tools that he had, right? And then they're like, okay,
Mhm.
but this is not quite right, so we have to apply it in this way, or we have to, rather than looking at this class and this class, we're going to look at this class and this class because that's what, we do here. And so, whereas Robinson's project related to Marx is more about digging into those areas that we don't actually love to talk about within Marx, where it's like, what's this thing with the Greeks? Like, what's this thing with, like, that Robinson is really, I mean, he talks about, I think he said Black Studies was the object of Black Studies was to be a critique of Western civilization, something along those lines. And I think for him, similar to like Sylvia Wynter, like his project is like a much deeper critique of Eurocentrism, of European civilization as a project, and of the way that aspects of, like, similar to these kind of racial regimes in this work, like how the bad stuff from way back gets kind of reincorporated into these new things, so that when you get to these bourgeois, revolutions of the Enlightenment, or of, secularity, or of the university, or science, that like embedded in them is still, it's like the fact that Hobbes is afraid of ghosts, right? It's like, there's just weird stuff here, right? That like we need to talk about, we need to acknowledge, like this like we can't actually take this person seriously as like the theorist of what the state should be if he's like afraid when he turns the lights out at night, like it's
So true.
so, and I think that that's like what Robinson's interested in. And so when he goes to Marx too, he's like, okay, like let's really talk about the things that we don't think that he could see clearly, and why he couldn't see those things clearly, what's going on. And also, he brings this stuff forward, and he still talks about, like, there's a section in Forgeries, which we talked about when we went to it, where he talks about some of his fascination with Greek civilization and
Right.
stuff. And Robinson's just like, no, man, like,
Yeah.
you should be able to see. But again, like, you can't, he's a product. Marx is a product. Again, these are all social relations, and you don't exist outside of the world that you grow up in, and the things that you're taught. And so, it's somewhat idealist. I think this maybe is one of also the problems that some people have with some of Robinson's critiques that way, is like, we can't expect Marx actually to be different or better necessarily than what he was like. And so then, but then the question is like, okay, so do we just let it sit there, right? Or do we actually then go and try to interrogate those things now that we have more information, and so I think that's Robinson's approach. Clearly he has a lot of reverence. Like, you don't sit and read all of the stuff that he does and delve into these things if he just like hates this stuff and thinks it's all bad, but anyway, so yeah, I guess that's what I'll say about that.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot more I could say too. I mean, it's interesting that of the person of their time argument, there's a way that I find that very thin sometimes. Like, I get it as a framework, but then there's a way that is also used to absolve people from actions that they took, or actions that they didn't take, or things that they chose to ignore or participate in. You get that a lot with like people in the American Revolution. A lot people who want to defend like, the revolution, right? Well, it was the stage of da 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 da, and like I'm like, okay, but they still were doing shit. And like, then how do you situate the fact that the slaves hated them, that well, they're products of their time.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I think that's true. And I mean, I think from my perspective, Marx does a lot to transcend a lot of what the thought of his time.
Same. I mean, he's a challenge to the thought of his time. Exactly.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think Robinson is in the same way. I think it's
Yeah.
just that it people, yeah. And I'll say, like, my issue too is, well, what I would say is, like, if people read some of his work, like, it's clear that he had a lot of reverence for Malcolm X, for Amilcar Cabral, for Frantz Fanon, like, etc. Like, he writes about these folks, and and so, even that argument, because people will say, well, the last section of Black Marxism, he talks about Du Bois, Richard Wright, and CLR James, and, like, that these are specific figures, they have specific relationships to these traditions, yada yada yada. And why didn't he talk about Nkrumah or uh,
Mm-hmm.
Amilcar Cabral? And the reality is, he does write about people. He doesn't do everything in one book, right? But I think that what I would say is, like, those are the people that I also look to very often for what I think are better revolutionary politics. To me, I still see it as a part of a tradition that Marx is a part of,
Oh,
and
same.
quite influential to.
Yeah.
Um, and I think Robinson would acknowledge that as well. But for some reason, and I think it's fine. Like, I think it's an interesting thing, and a lot of times this is a white Marxist thing too. Is, like, you want to claim somebody as a part of your tradition, and then if they don't say that, right, then you're something else. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's part of what's going on with Robinson too, is that he never claims it, and so then his critiques, it's like, well, these are critiques outside, so they're liberal critiques or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's exactly what happens, and that's kind of what I say when I happen with this guy. I have this critique of you. I'm suddenly outside the canon, like outside the framework. I've disobeyed the framework. But my question is, like, and who are you to set this framework?
Right. Yeah.
You know,
A white Marxist.
a white Marxist who works at a high end university and teaches young people who have lots of money because they can afford to go to these high end universities.
And honestly, like, that is what you're describing right there is a lot of what Section 3 of Black Marxism is about.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I look forward to
It's like
reading that and
it's
nodding my
like
head
Du
a little
Bois.
bit.
It's like Du Bois or CLR James being like, but wait, like, look at this. And then they're like, oh, you're kicked out of our party, dude.
Oh man, yeah.
That, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's kind of that's a lot of what he's laying out,
Yeah.
and some of it, I guess one of the thing, just in closing, is you can see through this book also that he's like, oh, look, the Soviet Union's doing this, like, American capital is like, let's descend into fascism to stop it. Like, he understands these
100%.
relationships.
100%. And like and if people cannot see, at least from this book, that he sees capitalism and Western expansion as an imperial project, and that socialism and communism as a force that was aggressively, counteracting that in a good way, right? Yeah, I don't. Then they're not reading the book fervently,
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been great.
Yeah, man. I appreciate it. This has been fun.
Yeah, a lot of fun.
Yeah.
We did it for 18 hours or something like that. A couple of closing comments. Also, the premise of Planet of the Apes. I think absolutely Planet of the Apes is like a colonial. Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Especially you go back and watch, like, the old ones with our buddy
Charles.
And
I'll say it real quick. Even the new ones.
Yeah.
These like the what is it, the prequels, essentially. Oh my god. Especially the second one where they had, like, the ape revolution and they had to stop out the ape revolutionary. I was like, what is this shit?
You're the gift and the curse. The analysis is awesome, illuminated, but now I look at all TVs and movies with a side eye. Yeah. Sorry. It's painful to have a good analysis.
Yeah.
At least you can hang out with folks like us and yell at everything. I believe Robinson talked about feeling duped with Sanders of the River, but did he ever say anything about Emperor Jones? I don't know.
I have to look back, and I'll do that. I feel like he did. I looked
Yeah.
this up years ago. I feel like he did a lot of like recounting of his life.
Yeah, and he tried to get, or I think there was a play version of CLR James's Toussaint Louverture, or not Louverture, Louverture. Shout out to Toussaint Louverture. But that he did also, that it didn't, like, it was only recently republished, the play. Actually, I think it's kind of the basis for the graphic novel, actually, that Verso has on. But yeah, he was in it, and there's just not, like, if you search it up, you'll get images of him in Emperor Jones, which is quite ironic because obviously on one end he's actually trying to do something very positive about a Haitian figure, and Emperor Jones is designed to demonize, the idea of Haiti.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
I know we got to get out of here. Yeah. All right. Thanks, everybody. This was great. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mtume, and we'll do something else soon, I'm sure. So, all right,
All right, bro.
This has been fun.
Peace.
All right, peace.